Hello, my dear friends. Orgasm could drive Victorian women crazy. They weren't allowed to talk about sex, but were cured by orgasm. Doctors touched their bodies without anyone calling it a sin. Strange devices began to appear in wooden cabinets, drawers, even wills. What was considered taboo became salvation. No one knows exactly when it began, only that the whole society was quietly shaken by it. Tonight, join me in exploring the most silent secret in the history of Victorian women. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now we dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step inside the drawing rooms and medical offices of Victorian England, one would find a world wrapped tightly in silence, where desire was treated as disease and emotion was labelled as madness. Every woman was expected to be modest, pure, and quiet, her worth measured by restraint rather than passion. Beneath layers of corsets, petticoats, and moral lectures, her body was not her own. The air inside those rooms was heavy, not from heat but from the weight of what was forbidden to speak. In this society, a woman's heart could ache, her body could tremble, yet no one called it longing. They called it nervous trouble, female weakness, or most famously, hysteria. Doctors described hysteria as the illness of the sensitive and civilized woman. It could mean almost anything: fainting, anxiety, irritability, sleeplessness, or sudden tears. The diagnosis spread faster than any epidemic, and unlike disease, it was not cured by medicine but by submission. Women went to doctors because they felt empty, trapped, or restless, and they were told that their suffering came from the uterus, not the world around them. It was easier to blame the body than to confront the cruelty of social rules. The body, they believed, was unruly and had to be tamed, its impulses silenced like disobedient children. Inside clinics, the methods of treatment looked disturbingly calm. Curtains were drawn, candles dimmed, and soft cloths laid out to preserve a sense of propriety. The doctor's hands became instruments of morality disguised as medicine. They touched not to comfort, but to correct, to discipline the body into obedience. Women were told to relax, to let the doctor release the tension of the nerves. In truth, they were being guided to climax, though no one dared call it that. What would have been scandalous in the bedroom was acceptable in the clinic. It is strange how easily sin becomes science when it wears a white coat. The irony of it all was that the very society that preached modesty had found a way to commercialize female pleasure without admitting its existence. To the men of medicine, the procedure was clinical. To the women, it was salvation they could not name. They trembled, cried, and afterwards felt lighter, calmer, even joyful. Doctors noted these reactions carefully, describing them as paroxysms, a word that hid the truth beneath Latin formality. The term was sterile enough to keep everyone respectable. Yet the line between healing and indulgence blurred with every visit. For many women, the symptoms of hysteria seemed endless because the cure was never meant to last. Relief was temporary, and so they returned again and again, craving the calm that followed each treatment. The medical appointment became the only socially acceptable moment when a woman could be touched without shame. Husbands were told it was therapy, not passion. Wives pretended to believe it. It is impossible not to notice how much power hides behind ignorance when ignorance is convenient. In the waiting rooms, women sat quietly with gloves on their laps, their expressions polite and blank. Some carried small bottles of smelling salts, others held their breath, pretending not to notice the faint sounds from the adjoining room. The air was scented with lavender and fear. Assistants moved silently, refilling basins of water and replacing linens, Everything was orderly, clean, and decent. Only the human element, those trembling hands and flushed faces, betrayed what truly occurred. Outside, life continued as if nothing unusual existed. Newspapers wrote about the progress of science, about machines that could measure pulse and pressure, but none mentioned the true machinery that kept countless women obedient shame disguised as care. The drawing rooms filled with polite conversation, while under the surface, thousands of women were being trained to feel guilt for their own biology. They believed the fault lay within themselves, not in the cage they were forced to live in. Hysteria soon became a profitable diagnosis. Doctors earned prestige. Families felt reassured that their wives and daughters were being treated, and society maintained its illusion of order. Women who felt stifled, unfulfilled, or even rebellious could be sent to a doctor to be balanced. In reality, they were being managed. The system fed on silence and survival. The more women obeyed, the sicker they became, and the sicker they became, the more treatments they required. In poorer districts, the practice took on rougher forms. Without private clinics or trained physicians, midwives and attendants imitated the therapy with crude means. There was no talk of consent, only duty. For many, it was a humiliating ordeal, a reminder that even their pain was not their own. The boundary between help and harm was almost invisible. The Victorian woman was trapped in a paradox. She was told to repress her body, yet blamed when her repression made her ill. The world around her offered no escape, only cycles of restraint and release. Each treatment room, each polished table, and clean linen told the same story. Behind propriety stood control. Behind medicine stood fear. The word hysteria may sound quaint now, but for women then, it was a cage built from ignorance and wrapped in science. The label erased individuality, turning every woman suffering into the same nameless affliction. It gave doctors permission to touch, and society permission to look away. There was comfort in the idea that illness, not oppression, was the cause of their distress. Those who dared to question the practice found themselves dismissed or mocked. To challenge the diagnosis was to challenge the very structure of the home and the church, and so hysteria endured, as convenient to men as it was destructive to women. The more the empire spoke of reason and progress, the deeper it buried the truth beneath lace and decorum. What they called medicine was, in truth, a ritual of submission performed in the name of health. The picture of a hysterical woman became a cultural symbol, fragile, trembling, beautifully broken. Pain was romanticized, desire demonized, and obedience rewarded. Those who recovered were praised for returning to gentleness. Those who resisted were quietly sent away to asylums, where silence became permanent. It is unsettling to think how easily compassion turned into control, and how control was mistaken for care. The women themselves had no vocabulary for freedom. The words they needed had not yet been invented. The tale of hysteria reveals the first cracks in the myth of Victorian virtue. Beneath the manners and lace, something restless stirred, a hunger for recognition, for touch that was not prescribed, for breath beyond the corset. Every treatment only reminded them of what was denied, and while the doctors believed they were calming nerves, they were awakening something much larger. The hysteria clinics stood as both temples and prisons, offering peace while enforcing obedience. They soothed the symptoms but deepened the silence. In the stillness of those candlelit rooms, one could hear the faint hum of a truth that refused to disappear. That truth, once spoken, would change everything about how the world understood women, and it would not stay hidden forever. The treatment rooms were small and dimly lit, their curtains drawn tight to keep curiosity away. The furniture was sparse: a chair, a basin, a table lined with folded towels. Women entered with quiet steps, their faces pale but composed, clutching their gloves as if decency could still protect them. They came not for pleasure, but for healing. At least that was what they told themselves. The word of the doctors was law, and the diagnosis was always the same: hysteria. A convenient name for every emotion that could not be explained: anxiety, melancholy, sleeplessness, or sudden tears all belong to the same invisible illness that only male hands could cure. The cure itself was simple, or so it was claimed. The doctor would ask the patient to lie back, to breathe slowly, and to trust his experience. With gloved hands, or sometimes bare ones, he would press and massage, applying just enough pressure to elicit trembling. The goal was to bring about what he called a paroxysm, a release of nervous energy that would calm the restless mind. The word sounded harmless, even sophisticated. In reality, it was a moment of involuntary pleasure that neither doctor nor patient was allowed to acknowledge. It is almost comical how language can turn desire into medicine with a single clever word. Women left the clinics feeling lighter, more serene, and for a brief time, genuinely well. They believed they were cured, unaware that their illness was the very repression imposed upon them. The procedure offered relief, but never freedom. They returned again and again, unable to explain why the calm never lasted. It was not sickness that drew them back, but the discovery of something their society had forbidden them to feel. Behind every curtain, the female body was reclaiming itself in silence. Doctors did not see it that way. They described their work as mechanical, methodical, and a clinical service to restore order. For them, the body was a machine, and its parts needed maintenance. There was no question of intimacy, no suggestion of impropriety. Every touch was justified by the vocabulary of science. If one looks at it with modern eyes, it is as though the medical profession had invented an industry of moral hypocrisy, pretending to heal what it secretly exploited. The demand for treatment grew so quickly that physicians struggled to keep up. Hours of physical manipulation left their hands sore and cramped. Some began to imagine tools that could save time and labour. The first mechanical devices appeared in London, and Paris, small vibrating instruments powered by water or steam. They were celebrated as brilliant innovations, allowing doctors to treat more patients efficiently. No one dared to mention what exactly they treated. The machines hummed softly, and women continued to sigh with relief, the sound mistaken for gratitude. The irony was that progress, so proudly declared by Victorian men, had been driven by the search for convenience in a ritual of denial. They had mechanized repression, turning women's unspoken desires into a profitable cycle of appointments and prescriptions. The women themselves did not complain. The therapy gave them an excuse to feel alive without guilt, to experience warmth in a life otherwise cold. For some, it became the only private joy they knew. It is strange how morality collapses so quietly when comfort stands to gain from it. In homes across the cities, women whispered about doctors who had gentle hands or unusual skill. The phrases carried meanings that no one dared to explain. Appointments were made discreetly, often in the middle of the day, under the pretense of headaches or fainting spells. Husbands approved of the visits, proud that their wives were under proper medical care. The deception pleased everyone. The doctors earned their fees, the women found momentary peace, and society continued to praise its own virtue. The boundary between care and corruption blurred until it vanished entirely. The women's reactions, once hidden behind walls, began to appear in medical literature as proof of successful treatment. Physicians recorded symptoms in detail: flushed cheeks, quickened breathing, sudden relaxation. They called it evidence of cure, never of pleasure. The hypocrisy was extraordinary, but in a world where the female body was property, truth was the least valuable currency. Over time, this ritual became almost ceremonial. The doctor's office took on the atmosphere of a chapel, the patient a silent devotee seeking redemption. Everything was arranged to preserve modesty, the dim light, the closed doors, the lowered eyes. The unspoken understanding was that relief must come without awareness. that healing required ignorance. This was how an empire built on moral restraint managed to give birth to an industry of hidden ecstasy. For those who could not afford private doctors, midwives and attendants began to imitate the procedure. Their techniques were rougher, their surroundings less clean, but the goal remained the same. Poor women came seeking calm, not realizing they were participants in the same strange ritual practiced by the wealthy. The illusion of medicine crossed class lines easily, because it spoke to something all women shared, the longing to feel something more than duty. By the end of the century, the word hysteria had become both a diagnosis and an excuse. It explained everything that made women human, yet denied them the right to be fully human. The clinics continued to multiply, and the machines grew smaller, more efficient, more discreet. Doctors congratulated themselves on their progress, unaware that the true transformation was not mechanical but emotional. Something inside the woman had begun to change. What started as shame had slowly turned into curiosity. What began as treatment was becoming an awakening. The empire prided itself on order, yet inside its quiet rooms, chaos lived disguised as care. The bodies of women told stories their mouths could not. The doctors listened only to the parts that suited their reports. History remembers this practice as a medical oddity, but for the women who lived it, it was both salvation and captivity. Their calm smiles on the way home were masks, carefully stitched from necessity. Beneath them, something stirred, something that would not remain hidden forever. The therapy that was supposed to silence women had instead begun to teach them how to listen to themselves. In that listening, a dangerous truth was forming that the body was not sinful, that pleasure was not disease, and that obedience was not peace. That truth would soon escape the clinic walls, and once it did, the empire's illusion of control would never be the same again. The ritual of medicine had turned into a quiet rebellion dressed in white gloves. Behind each polite curtain, the unspoken language of the body grew stronger with every treatment. It was only a matter of time before that language demanded to be heard. In the drawing rooms of London and Bath, where velvet curtains filtered the afternoon light and the air smelled faintly of perfume and coal, women of the upper class gathered in whispers. Their conversations were gentle, their laughter controlled, yet their eyes betrayed something restless. Between sips of tea and the rustle of silk skirts, they exchanged names not of tailors, nor of jewellers, but of physicians. The most sought-after doctors were spoken of as though they were artists, praised not for cures but for discretion. A quiet competition spread among them, as each lady sought an appointment with the man whose hands were gifted. Behind every polite phrase was a secret too delicate to name. The treatment that had begun as a medical necessity had become a hidden luxury. For the wealthy, hysteria offered an acceptable reason to seek attention that society otherwise denied them. The visits to the doctor's office became part of their routine, no different from their beauty rituals or spiritual consultations. They carried themselves with the elegance of patients, not lovers, yet their anticipation betrayed a different truth. It is remarkable how society can condemn pleasure in public but celebrate it in private, as long as it wears a mask of virtue. Each woman convinced herself that what she did was proper because it was prescribed. The more she returned, the easier it became to believe. Appointments are filled every hour of the doctor's day. The waiting rooms were crowded with fine dresses, jewelled hairpins, and perfume that mingled with the faint odour of antiseptic. Servants waited outside, pretending not to know what their mistresses were truly doing. The doctors, exhausted but profitable, began to choose their clients carefully, preferring the ones who could pay well and ask few questions. Some even kept private lists, noting which ladies were delicate and which were responsive. It was a new kind of social register, one where intimacy was currency. The line between therapy and indulgence blurred until it no longer mattered. The women who once fainted from the tightness of corsets now swooned in candlelit clinics, their sighs recorded as symptoms of relief. To outsiders, they were merely maintaining their health. To themselves, they were tasting something forbidden. If it happened today, It would be like people booking luxury spa treatments while pretending to see a doctor for anxiety. They all know what it is, but no one says it aloud. In lavish homes, gossip about the good doctors became a form of intimacy among friends. Over dinners and garden parties, names passed quietly from one gloved hand to another. The most skilled physicians were said to have waiting lists longer than the finest dressmakers. It was not uncommon for a woman to feign illness just to secure an appointment. The thrill was not only in the act, but in the secrecy that surrounded it. Discretion became the highest form of temptation. For the doctors, the profits were extraordinary. They charged for the procedure, for the privacy, and for their silence. Some were invited to travel with wealthy families as personal physicians, their role extending beyond medicine into companionship. They became witnesses to confessions never spoken elsewhere. Yet behind their professional masks, even they were caught in the illusion of righteousness. Many convinced themselves they were serving science, not desire, and perhaps that lie was the only thing that allowed them to continue. It is unsettling to see how easily money can make morality forget its own rules. Newspapers occasionally hinted at the trend, publishing articles about female nerves and modern cures. Readers recognized the code but pretended otherwise. The polite language of medical advancement provided cover for the spread of something closer to social contagion. The more civilized the world claimed to be, the more it relied on secrecy to function. Every whisper about a physician's technique was another reminder that repression had found its own economy. The wealthy women carried their guilt like an accessory, polished but heavy. They confessed to no one, not even to themselves, that what they sought was not healing but awakening. Some felt ashamed, others triumphant. Many began to request their sessions more frequently, finding that the relief from anxiety lasted only as long as the visits did. The doctors recommended maintenance treatments, and the cycle became endless. What had once been a cure for nervousness now fed the very disorder it claimed to treat. Servants, maids, and governesses were sometimes drawn into the secret as accomplices. They arranged the carriages, handled the letters, and ensured that no husbands grew suspicious. In exchange, they received gifts or raises, though the price of knowledge was fear. To know too much about a lady's routine was dangerous. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, and a life of service could be destroyed. Silence became a form of survival, a language all its own. The doctors began to notice subtle changes in their patients. Some arrived with confidence, no longer shy or trembling. They looked the physician in the eye, spoke clearly, and even laughed. The transformation puzzled the men who had built their authority on women's fragility. They could not see that they had awakened something far more powerful than submission. What they believed they were curing was, in truth, the first flicker of independence. In this strange exchange of touch and denial, both sides found what they needed. The women found release from the tightness of their world. The men found status and wealth. Society carried on, content to pretend that nothing was amiss. The hypocrisy was almost perfect, sustained by etiquette and fear. No one dared to name the truth, for naming it would have meant destroying the illusion that held the empire together. These clandestine appointments became a ritual of their own, an unspoken rebellion under the disguise of refinement. The women wore their dignity like armour, and the doctors wore their titles like shields. Behind each polite greeting lay a transaction of desire and denial that neither dared to define. The empire itself seemed to breathe through these quiet, private acts, exhaling its contradictions into every perfumed room. The sickness was no longer hysteria, it was hypocrisy itself. The silent ritual of indulgence had become its own kind of religion, with believers dressed in lace and confession taking place in candlelight. Each sigh within those rooms carried more than relief, it carried the sound of awakening. And from that awakening, something far greater than desire was beginning to take shape, something that would no longer stay hidden behind velvet curtains. In the grand houses where silence was a symbol of breeding and discipline, the women who once visited doctors regularly began to tremble again. The servants noticed first, a hand shaking at the breakfast table, a cup of tea spilling quietly onto lace. The wives claimed fatigue or nerves, but their eyes betrayed panic. Their bodies had grown used to the rhythm of treatment, to the strange relief that came from it. Without it, the restlessness returned, sharper and more cruel. They called it faintness, but it was hunger of another kind, a hunger no polite word could satisfy. When the doctors were unavailable or away, the symptoms grew violent. Some women gasped for breath, their hearts racing as though chased by invisible hands. They clutched at furniture, shivered uncontrollably, or cried out in confusion. Family members stood helpless, convinced they were witnessing madness. The truth was too indecent to imagine. These women were not ill from disease, but from deprivation. Their bodies remembered what society demanded they forget. It is almost absurd that the same culture that feared pleasure had accidentally made women dependent on it for sanity. The husbands, bewildered and embarrassed, summoned physicians in the middle of the night. Doctors arrived with their instruments and calm voices, restoring order to scenes of chaos. The paroxysms returned, the women relaxed, and the households resumed their fragile peace. What should have been a scandal was instead treated as domestic routine. The men preferred ignorance. It preserved their dignity. Wives who had once been invisible suddenly became the centre of attention, but only under the condition of being patients. The boundary between sickness and desire blurred completely. Rumours began to circulate among servants and neighbours. In some districts, women were said to suffer from fits if their appointments were delayed too long. A few were found convulsing in their bedrooms, their cries echoing through corridors. Doctors explained these as seizures of nervous exhaustion, but those who had seen them knew otherwise. The convulsions stopped only after the physician's visit. The more often it happened, the more everyone pretended not to see. If this took place in the modern world, it would be like mistaking addiction for therapy and praising the medicine that caused the craving. The symptoms grew theatrical in some cases. Women collapsed in church pews, fainted at the dinner table, or screamed into pillows when no one was watching. Their families whispered of madness, but the truth was quieter and more pitiful. These were the echoes of bodies awakened and then abandoned. Deprivation had become a new form of hysteria, one born not from repression but from brief contact with freedom. Once the body had been allowed to feel, it could no longer pretend to forget. A few women, desperate and clever, learned to use their episodes as leverage. They staged fits to summon their doctors sooner, knowing that no husband would question a medical emergency. In a world where women's voices carried little weight, feigned illness became their only means of control. Some even admitted, in the privacy of their diaries, that their attacks were performances, a secret act of rebellion played out in bedrooms. The irony was painful. What they pretended had once been forced upon them. There is something deeply tragic about a society where women must counterfeit illness just to experience being alive. Doctors, meanwhile, began to notice patterns. They saw that the women who demanded constant treatment were often the most educated, the most confined, the most lonely. The physicians themselves grew uneasy, aware that they were feeding something they could not name, yet the system rewarded their silence. Every relapse meant another visit, another fee, another confirmation that the medical establishment was indispensable. The same empire that celebrated progress had created dependence and called it care. Not every woman suffered quietly. Some grew angry, though they had no language for their rage. They felt trapped in a cycle of indulgence and shame, of relief and guilt. The feeling of freedom after treatment was followed by despair when the effect faded. They could not speak of it to their husbands, and the doctors treated them like puzzles, not people. The body spoke louder than any words could, but no one wanted to hear its meaning. The result was a society trembling beneath its own denial. In private journals, reformers began to question the morality of these treatments. They wrote cautiously, hiding their notes behind false book covers. One physician admitted that he could no longer tell where medicine ended and desire began. Another confessed that the patients were not hysterical at all. They were starved for affection and confined by custom. These realizations were dangerous. To say them aloud would have destroyed reputations, perhaps even marriages. So the truth stayed locked away, just like the women themselves. In drawing rooms, the conversation continued as if nothing had changed. Women praised their physicians. Husbands boasted about the efficiency of modern medicine, and society congratulated itself on its civility. But beneath the layers of silk and etiquette, something unstable was growing. The line between passion and pathology had vanished, leaving only pretense. The world was watching women tremble, not realizing that it was their own creation shaking before them. It was a strange kind of madness, one born not from sin but from silence. The empire had trapped its women between purity and need, demanding they deny the very instincts that made them human. When the body rebelled, it did so in the only language it knew: convulsion, trembling, tears. The doctors called it a cure. The patients knew it was a confession. And in that confession, hidden beneath every shudder, was a plea not for medicine, but for mercy. The tremors that began in those quiet rooms would not stay contained. What started as symptoms of nervous distress had become a silent revolt, each spasm a protest against the morality that kept them bound. It was not illness that haunted the Empire's daughters, but the unbearable weight of obedience itself. The very cure meant to calm them was teaching their bodies to remember what freedom felt like, and that memory would not fade again. The rise of the new medical machines began quietly, with no hint of scandal or excitement. They appeared in advertisements and medical journals as symbols of progress. These devices, powered by water, electricity, or small internal gears, were promoted as tools to restore balance to the female nervous system. They carried names that sounded serious and respectable, such as nerve regulators or vibratory massagers. The language was carefully chosen to hide their true purpose. Doctors called them scientific marvels, and the public accepted the explanation without question. Physicians were the first to celebrate the invention. Their hands, once exhausted from hours of manual treatment, finally found relief in the efficiency of technology. The machines promised precision and hygiene, removing the discomfort of direct contact between doctor and patient. It was easier to believe that progress had solved a moral problem. The hum of the machines filled the treatment rooms, soft and rhythmic, blending with the sound of ticking clocks. It is ironic how quickly guilt disappears when it is hidden behind the noise of progress. Women embraced the new devices with gratitude. They were told it was safer, faster, and more respectable than traditional methods. Some machines used water pressure to stimulate the skin. Others used electrical pulses to awaken the nerves. The sensations were the same as before, but the explanation had changed. The procedure was described as relaxation therapy, not indulgence. When the treatment ended, women left the clinics calm and radiant, convinced that science had granted them purity once more. Soon, the advertisements reached beyond medical circles. Illustrated pamphlets showed elegant ladies seated beside gleaming brass instruments. The words spoke of improved circulation and emotional balance. Nowhere did they mention pleasure. The deception was elegant and complete. These machines were presented as part of a modern household, something every refined woman should possess. The idea spread like perfume through the air of upper society. The wealthy began to import machines from Europe, paying extravagant prices. The French and German models were the most coveted, polished until they shone like jewellery. Some were powered by water systems installed in private bathrooms. Others came in small velvet-lined boxes that could be hidden beneath pillows or dressing tables. Maids were forbidden to touch them. The owner spoke of them as health devices, even when their hands trembled in anticipation of use. If one compares it to the present day, it would be like buying an expensive wellness gadget that promises peace while secretly selling pleasure. Shops that sold medical supplies suddenly became profitable. Their windows displayed harmless equipment, thermometers, bandages, and scalpels. Behind the counter, in small locked cabinets, stood the machines that everyone asked for by name but never described. The clerks understood the code. When a lady requested a nerve regulator, they smiled politely and wrapped it in plain paper. Some stores even offered demonstrations in private rooms, claiming to teach correct medical technique. The profit from silence was immense. At social gatherings, whispers about the new machines spread with excitement disguised as curiosity. Women spoke in careful phrases about devices that truly soothed the nerves. Their friends nodded, smiling with recognition. The servants who overheard these conversations never repeated them, knowing too well the cost of disloyalty. A new form of luxury had emerged. One that could not be flaunted yet was desired by everyone who knew it existed. For the doctors, the machines were a blessing and a burden. They allowed them to treat more patients and to claim greater professionalism, but they also raised questions. Some physicians admitted privately that the devices were merely a continuation of the same treatment by other means. Others pretended not to see the obvious. The illusion of morality had to be protected at all costs. It is difficult not to notice how progress often serves to refine denial rather than replace it. As the machines spread, they began to define a new kind of woman. The patients who once blushed at every touch now spoke confidently about their health. They believed that taking control of their own well-being was a sign of sophistication. To own such a device was proof of education and modern taste. The quiet hum of the machine became a sound of independence, a secret that needed no words. The empire prided itself on its morality, yet these inventions exposed its contradictions. A civilization that forbade desire had created the most efficient tool for granting it. The irony was too vast to see. Progress was worshipped as purity, even when it disguised indulgence. The empire could forgive technology for doing what it would never forgive the body. In diaries and private letters, women described the machines in gentle phrases. They wrote of a new kind of calm or a sense of clarity afterward. The tone was proper, the sentences neat, but beneath the words was a pulse of truth. They had discovered a form of freedom that did not need confession. In their rooms, behind locked doors, the hum of the device was the only sound that belonged entirely to them. Manufacturers competed to create faster, quieter, and more refined versions. Some designs included gold plating or silk-covered handles to appeal to taste as much as function. Others promised the softest touch or the most reliable results. These details mattered, for the women buying them were not seeking medicine alone. They were purchasing a piece of modern identity, a symbol of belonging to an age that pretended to be civilized while trembling under its own restraint. By the end of the century, the machines had become part of the rhythm of daily life. They existed in hospitals, in private homes, in the trunks of travelling women. No one spoke openly of their purpose, yet everyone who used them understood. What had begun as treatment had turned into a quiet revolution, a transformation hidden behind polite smiles and lace curtains. The invention that claimed to heal had become something far greater. It gave women a power their world was not ready to name. Behind every curtain and under every embroidered pillow, the soft hum of progress carried the sound of awakening that would not be silenced again. When the doctors grew too busy to handle the endless stream of patients, they turned to those already within their reach. The women who worked quietly in their households, invisible and obedient, became the next tools of convenience. Servants were everywhere, and in a society built on hierarchy, obedience was guaranteed. Physicians began to train female attendants to perform the delicate treatments when they themselves could not be present. What had once been considered an act of medical precision was now passed down like a household chore. The instruction was spoken softly and recorded in no book, yet it spread quickly, carried by whispers and necessity. The lessons were practical and discreet. The attendants were shown how to warm towels, how to press them gently against the skin, and how to move their hands in a slow, rhythmic motion. They were told to comfort their mistresses, to soothe the nerves, and to remain silent. Some were given exact instructions, others were left to guess. The women who received this training were often young, uneducated, and terrified of displeasing their employers. They obeyed not because they understood, but because they feared losing the small wages that kept them alive. It is disturbing how easily duty can disguise coercion, when survival is the only choice. In the large houses of the upper class, a strange new intimacy developed between mistress and maid. The servants performed the therapy under the pretense of medical care. Curtains were drawn, lamps dimmed, and the soft rustle of cloth filled the air. The mistresses closed their eyes and allowed themselves to believe it was medicine. The servants, trembling, followed the steps as instructed. They learned quickly that silence was safety. The more experienced they became, the more indispensable they were considered. The doctors encouraged the practice, writing it into household instructions as if it were nothing unusual. They called it supportive treatment or home continuation. The arrangement was perfect for everyone except the women performing the work. The physicians earned their fees, the patients received their comfort, and the servants carried the burden. There were no written complaints, no recorded objections. Only in private letters and rumours did the truth emerge. Some maids were seen crying in the kitchens afterward, unable to explain their distress. Others withdrew completely, their eyes dull and empty. Among the servants, stories spread quickly. They spoke of employers who demanded sessions at odd hours, of hands that trembled from exhaustion, of feelings they did not have words to describe. They understood that what they were doing was not ordinary housework, yet there was no one to tell, no one to believe them if they did. The very structure of their lives depended on silence. If it happened in modern times, it would be like workers forced to perform tasks far beyond their consent while being told it was just part of their job. For some, the emotional toll was devastating. The line between care and violation blurred in their minds. They could not name the discomfort, only feel its weight long after the sessions ended. Their dreams filled with fragments of the treatment rooms, the soft linen, the smell of oil, the dim light pressing on their eyelids. Many developed nervous tremors or sudden fits of fear. They were told they were simply tired, that servants often grew hysterical from overwork. No one considered that they might have inherited the very hysteria they were ordered to treat. The mistresses, meanwhile, remained unaware or pretended to be. They viewed the servants as extensions of their own comfort, tools to preserve dignity and discretion. Some even took pride in training their maids to perform the therapy correctly, boasting that their households were modern and self-sufficient. The hypocrisy was complete. The same society that shamed women for desiring touch had now institutionalized it under another woman's hands. It is painful to imagine how cruelty can wear the face of refinement and call itself progress. Doctors justified their actions easily. They claimed that the presence of another woman in the process ensured propriety. The logic was simple and cruel if a servant performed the act. It could not possibly be immoral. It became a ritual of modesty built entirely on exploitation. The women of the upper class were praised for their composure, while the maids who enabled it were dismissed as fragile, foolish, or unstable. The world remained divided neatly between those who felt and those who served. In private, some servants refused the task and were promptly replaced. Refusal meant disobedience, and disobedience meant starvation. The system protected itself perfectly. The doctors provided the knowledge, the mistresses provided the power, and the maids provided the silence. Every participant was trapped by circumstance, each pretending that the arrangement was acceptable. The cost of maintaining appearances was paid in quiet suffering. In cities, this practice expanded beyond private homes. Clinics began to hire young attendants to assist physicians, calling them therapeutic aides. These women received the same vague instructions and the same impossible expectations. They were neither nurses nor servants, but something in between, without protection or recognition. The irony of it was unbearable. The medical world had created yet another class of women whose purpose was to absorb the consequences of men's ideas. The empire, proud of its order and progress, never saw the cruelty behind its civility. It prided itself on logic and purity, while its daughters and servants performed rituals of submission disguised as healing. History would later call it innovation. The truth was far less noble. Beneath every gesture of care was a transaction of fear, and beneath every lesson taught was a wound that would never be spoken aloud. The quiet training of the servants had become another symptom of the same disease. The more the empire sought to control women's bodies, the more it found new ways to involve them in their own confinement. The doctors had created assistants to their deception, and the servants had learned to live with the cost of obedience. And in the stillness of those rooms, where one woman trembled and another served, the illusion of peace continued to hum softly, pretending to be mercy while feeding despair. In the quiet hours between morning duties and afternoon visits, the bedrooms of many respectable homes began to change. Curtains were drawn tighter than usual. Candles were lit even when the sun still shone through the windows, and the air grew heavy with the scent of lavender and oil. The bed, once a symbol of marital order, became something else entirely. It turned into a space of healing, of secrecy, and of ritual. Women arranged towels, warmed water, and prepared the room as though expecting company, though no one was meant to see. These were not moments of sin in their minds, but of survival. What had once required a doctor's hand could now be done alone. Privacy was the rarest luxury of all. Husbands left for work or business, and for a few precious hours, the house belonged entirely to its mistress. She moved quietly, making sure that servants stayed occupied in other rooms. Then she closed the door and began her therapy. The sound of the street outside faded, replaced by the low hum of breathing and the faint crackle of candle flame. Every detail mattered. The towels had to be warm, the oil not too thick, the scent soft enough to disguise everything else. It is strange how easily guilt becomes routine when the body learns to call it medicine. The women who practiced this midday ritual were not rebels in their own eyes. They saw themselves as caretakers of their fragile health. Doctors had told them the treatment was essential for balance and composure, and they believed it. They even scheduled their sessions with discipline, fitting them neatly between household duties. Some referred to it as their rest period. Others said it was for their nerves. The language of illness made everything permissible. It was the perfect disguise for desire, wrapped in the vocabulary of virtue. Over time, these private treatments became as regular as any habit. Women prepared themselves with precision, knowing exactly how long the relief would last. The candles burned down to the same point each day, and the air always carried the same sweetness of scented oil. When the therapy ended, they tidied the room, changed the linens, and returned to their duties with a calm that seemed almost saintly. Their husbands returned home in the evening to wives who were composed and gentle, never suspecting what had taken place hours before. If it happened today, it would be like taking a daily vitamin that everyone knows is not for health, but for peace of mind. For some, the act became more than treatment. It turned into a ritual of self-possession. They found a kind of rhythm that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with control. Their bodies, long treated as property of marriage, became their own for a few stolen minutes. They rediscovered sensations that no one had taught them to value. The irony was quiet but profound. A society built on repressing pleasure had, through its own hypocrisy, given women the tools to claim it. Letters and diaries from the time spoke indirectly of these habits. Women wrote of private hours for recovery, of home therapy during the day, of moments of calm that preserved the spirit. The tone was clinical, but the meaning was clear. Each note was a confession hidden inside respectability. They could not speak openly of pleasure, yet they chronicled it carefully, as if afraid to forget. The words were not for anyone else to read. They were for memory, for the part of themselves that lived in secret. Some women invited trusted friends to share their discoveries. Afternoon teas sometimes turned into quiet conversations about nerves and recovery. Recommendations were exchanged in cautious whispers. One might mention a new oil, another a brand of candle that burned without smoke. They spoke as if discussing recipes, but the looks in their eyes betrayed a deeper understanding. Behind the polite laughter, they were building a network of women who knew the same secret that healing could also mean awakening. Servants were often the silent witnesses. They noticed the routines, the towels drying in unexpected places, the faint smell of oil that lingered after their mistress left the room. Most said nothing. Silence was part of their duty. A few pitied their employers, while others envied them. The women of the house lived in gilded cages, but at least they had the key for a moment each day. The maids, always watched, had no such escape. They only saw the faint traces of someone else's freedom and carried on with their chores. The doctors pretended not to know what they had created. They heard reports of improvement and prescribed home continuation. In medical journals, they wrote that women who maintained regular treatment at home recovered faster. They called it a sign of discipline and moral responsibility. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The very system that denied women their desires now encouraged them to pursue those same desires privately, as long as they called it therapy. It is impossible not to feel that science, in its arrogance, had simply replaced the confessional with the bedroom. By the end of the century, the idea of domestic treatment had become so common that no one questioned it. Women were expected to manage their own nerves, just as they managed their homes. Machines were available by post. Oils were sold under the label of tonics, and pamphlets described the importance of daily care. What had once been scandalous had turned into an unspoken routine that stretched across every level of society. From the grand houses of London to the quiet cottages in the countryside, the hum of self-care filled the afternoons like a secret hymn. In these private rooms, lit by the trembling light of candles, a new kind of freedom took shape. It was quiet, repetitive, and deeply human. The empire had unknowingly given its women something it could never take back. In learning to heal themselves, they had learned to touch their own power. And though the world outside remained strict and cold, inside those locked rooms, the air was warm, scented, and alive with the quiet rebellion of survival. The story began in a small, ordinary kitchen, the kind that smelled faintly of soap and ironed linens. The woman who lived there had never been to a clinic. Her husband's wages were meagre, her children often ill, and her days filled with endless chores. But she had read, or perhaps overheard, whispers about the machines that cured women's nerves. She could not afford one, yet the thought refused to leave her mind. Each time her body trembled with exhaustion. She remembered those stories of calm and relief that other women spoke about so softly. So one day, she turned her attention to the only machine she owned, her sewing machine. The device sat by the window, its metal frame dulled by years of use. Its rhythm was something she knew by heart, a constant companion in silence. She understood how the wheel turned, how the pedal controlled its motion, and how a simple movement of her foot could bring it to life. What she did next was not planned. She simply followed an idea born from need. She attached a small piece of fabric, padded it with layers of cloth, and connected it to the wheel. When she pressed the pedal, the machine began to hum differently, softer, more intimate. The vibration moved through the table, through her hands, through her skin. It startled her at first, then filled her with something she had not felt in years, a quiet, private peace. From that day on, the sewing machine had two purposes. In the morning, it mended shirts and aprons. In the afternoon, when the house was still, it mended her nerves. She told no one. The door was locked, the curtains closed, and the sound of the pedal seemed no different from before. She worked steadily, pretending to fix hems and seams while her body rediscovered its strength. It is almost comical that progress can begin not in laboratories or royal salons, but in the desperate hands of a housewife with nothing to lose. Word spread slowly, passed between women who visited each other for tea or errands. At first, it was mentioned as a rumour, a curious story about a clever woman who had turned her sewing machine into a doctor. But as the weeks went by, more began to try. Some failed and broke their machines. Others succeeded and said nothing. The invention became a quiet legend, told in whispers between women who pretended not to know what they were talking about. The phrase, "a little mechanical comfort," became a private joke among housewives. They smiled knowingly, their eyes full of exhaustion and understanding. The simplicity of the design made it almost impossible to condemn. It was not a medical device, not an object of luxury, but a common tool. No one would suspect anything improper. Even when husbands heard the rhythmic sound of the pedal, they assumed their wives were simply mending clothes. The deception was perfect because it was invisible. It turned survival into innovation. If it happened today, it would be like transforming a kitchen appliance into a symbol of quiet rebellion, while pretending it was just another household gadget. For the woman who first created it, the act was never about rebellion. It was about need. Her body had become another machine, overworked and neglected. The therapy, though unspoken, gave her relief that sleep could not. When she finished, she would wash her hands, tidy the room, and prepare supper as if nothing had changed. But something had. The fear that once lived behind her ribs had softened. For a brief moment, she belonged to herself again. Neighbours began to notice that she seemed calmer, her temper lighter, her laughter less forced. They asked what medicine she used, and she shrugged, saying only that she had learned to take better care of her health. She never shared the secret directly, though her sewing machine began to attract curious glances. Sometimes, when another woman came to visit, she would linger near the window, eyeing the device as if it might speak. The housewife would smile faintly and change the subject. The unspoken bond between them was stronger than any confession. As more women followed her example, a quiet movement formed across working-class homes. They had no manifestos or leaders, only imitation and rumour. The sound of sewing machines filled the afternoons of countless houses, blending the rhythm of labour with the rhythm of release. What was once a symbol of domestic burden had become an instrument of survival. The irony was too sharp to ignore. The same society that confined women to housework had unknowingly given them the very tool to reclaim their peace. Doctors never wrote about this phenomenon, though some must have known. It was beneath their notice, or perhaps beyond their comprehension. To them, progress came from universities and laboratories, not from kitchens. Yet the truth was simple. The women who could not afford therapy had invented their own. They did not need science to explain what their bodies already understood. They had found healing in the most ordinary sound, a wheel turning under the steady push of a foot. It is both tragic and beautiful that desperation can sometimes create more progress than privilege ever could. The legend of the sewing machine spread quietly through the empire, changing shape with each retelling. Some said the woman lived in Manchester. Others claimed she was from London. No one remembered her name, but her invention survived her. It travelled from one generation to another, hidden in memory, disguised as a household story. When women spoke of her, they did so with affection, as if she were a saint of their own making. In their eyes, she had turned despair into ingenuity and shame into resilience. In the soft rhythm of those sewing machines, a quiet defiance took hold. The empire that prided itself on order and morality could not hear it, for it sounded like every other sound in the home. Yet beneath that steady hum was the pulse of rebellion, the heartbeat of survival, and the whisper of women who had learned, through necessity, that healing sometimes begins where silence ends. In the dim parlours and locked bedrooms of the Victorian world, pleasure became a kind of revelation. The women who experienced it spoke of it cautiously, if at all, for the language of their time had no words to contain it. They called it calmness, or renewal, or spiritual cleansing. But behind those gentle phrases was something deeper and more defiant. For a few seconds, their bodies escaped the endless weight of corsets, duties, and expectations. It was as if the air changed colour, as if life, so often grey and narrow, briefly opened into brilliance. That moment was forbidden and divine at once, and though they dared not name it, they sought it again and again. Many described it later, in the safety of their diaries, as a kind of light that came from nowhere. They could not say whether it was physical or spiritual. Some compared it to prayer, others to illness, because the trembling felt both painful and cleansing. The intensity frightened them, yet it also made them feel alive. For women who were told that modesty was virtue and stillness was grace, to tremble was to touch the edge of existence. It is ironic that in an age obsessed with control, the most profound moments came from surrender. In those brief seconds, they felt as though their bodies had left them. The skin no longer belonged to duty, to marriage, to expectation. It belonged to sensation, to breath, to something that felt like freedom. When the wave passed, they lay still, half frightened by their own power. The room seemed different, the air sharper, the silence deeper. It was not merely pleasure but recognition, the realization that they were something more than the roles they had been taught to play. The experience was too intimate for speech, too bright for confession. Religion had told them that the body was a vessel of sin, yet what they felt resembled grace. Many wrote of visions that accompanied the moment flashes of light, warmth spreading through their limbs, a peace that felt almost sacred. They did not understand it, but they feared it less than the emptiness that came before. To feel even a spark of radiance in a world that denied their worth was to taste salvation. Some wondered if this was what faith truly meant, not the sermons of the church, but the quiet knowledge that they were alive and unbroken. If it happened today, it would be compared to finding divinity in an experience science still struggles to name. The diaries where they recorded these sensations were hidden carefully, tucked inside drawers beneath folded linens. They were written in delicate handwriting, often disguised as notes about health or dreams. To an unknowing reader, they would seem innocent, but every word carried a secret pulse. These journals were not only records of experience but acts of preservation. They were proof that something sacred could exist in ordinary lives, even in the bodies society tried to silence. Some pages trembled with guilt, others with wonder. The shame faded quickly, replaced by gratitude for a feeling that, for once, belonged to no one but them. For many women, this light became a kind of refuge. The world outside their rooms was full of judgment and noise, but within those private walls, they could dissolve into something pure and wordless. It was a trance, a departure from the endless repetition of their days, the clatter of dishes, the weight of corsets, the sermons about modesty. All of it disappeared for a moment that felt eternal. When it ended, the dullness returned, but the memory stayed, like the after-image of a candle that has gone out. Letters between close friends hinted at this shared experience, though never directly. They wrote of moments of awakening, of radiant stillness, of feeling touched by light. The language was vague enough to pass unnoticed, yet those who knew understood. In their cautious handwriting they built a secret theology of their own, one that worshipped not the church, but the living body. They found holiness where others found shame. The contradiction was beautiful in its quiet defiance. These women were never taught that pleasure could exist without sin, yet their own hearts told them otherwise. They saw no demons in their experiences, only the truth of their humanity. In a world that preached endurance, they had found joy. In a life that valued silence, they had found a soundless song within their flesh. And though they might have felt alone, the same awakening was happening in countless rooms across the empire, unseen but connected. Doctors, of course, could not admit what they had unleashed. They called it relief, or treatment, or neuromuscular release. But the women who lived it knew better. It was not a cure for hysteria. It was the end of submission, even if only for a heartbeat. The Empire's machinery had given them a gift it never intended, the knowledge that their bodies could lead them to transcendence without permission or guidance. Something is haunting about how enlightenment can grow from ignorance, as if the darkness itself teaches how to see. What began as a prescription had turned into a revelation. The bedrooms that once echoed with quiet despair were now places where the sacred and the forbidden met. Each time the light returned, they met it without words, knowing that it was theirs alone. They were not cured, they were awakened. And though the world outside their doors remained grey and cold, inside their secret moments, everything glowed. They would never speak of it in public, nor did they need to. The diaries, the trembling hands, the fleeting brightness, all of it remained theirs, and perhaps that was enough. For in a society built on restraint, to feel fully alive, even for an instant, was the purest rebellion imaginable. In the back rooms of houses and the quiet corners of tea shops, something new began to take shape. Women who had once met only to discuss recipes or sewing patterns now gathered for other reasons. They came carrying secrets, not gossip. Each meeting began with polite laughter, the kind that disguised nervousness, and ended in a silence filled with understanding. They were not rebels in appearance. Their hair was pinned neatly, their gloves perfectly white, their voices soft and proper. Yet behind their calm faces, they shared a truth that no one dared to speak aloud. The world saw them as fragile, but they had found something powerful, and it bound them together. These gatherings were not large. A handful of women at a time, chosen carefully, sworn to discretion. One would host under the pretense of a charity circle or a reading club. Another would bring her device hidden in a basket of linens. Curtains were drawn, lamps turned low, and the sound of the outside world faded. In that private glow, they spoke openly in the language of experience rather than shame. They compared sensations, shared what had helped, and whispered about the strange lightness that followed each treatment. To outsiders, it would have sounded like madness. To them, it was salvation. It is remarkable how easily secrecy becomes a form of worship when the truth feels too dangerous to name. Some women were cautious, afraid to admit too much. Others were bold, describing their experiences with the precision of scientists. They spoke of rhythm, temperature, and breathing, as if mapping the geography of their own bodies. The tone was not erotic, but reverent. They saw themselves as students of healing, not sinners. Their gatherings were half lecture, half ritual. One would demonstrate how to warm the towels, another how to angle the device for comfort. There was laughter, embarrassment, and occasionally tears. These moments felt sacred, not scandalous. As their numbers grew, they began to create symbols. Some embroidered small marks on their handkerchiefs. Others wore pins shaped like tiny spirals, meaningless to anyone else but instantly recognizable to those who knew. These symbols were not about vanity. They were acts of solidarity, proof that no woman was entirely alone in her discovery. The badges glimmered subtly under the gaslight, quiet emblems of defiance in a world that still called pleasure a disease. If it happened in modern times, it would be like belonging to a private online group that claims to teach wellness, while really preserving a forbidden kind of freedom. What made these gatherings extraordinary was not their daring, but their gentleness. There was no manifesto, no demand for change, no shouting against injustice. The women simply existed together in honesty, something the outside world never allowed. They comforted each other, traded letters, and even sent small parcels of scented oils through the post. Each gift carried both gratitude and secrecy. The postal clerks who handled them never guessed their purpose, but every package was a small rebellion wrapped in paper. Not all the meetings took place in drawing rooms. Some were held in the basements of modest homes, others in rented spaces under the guise of health societies. They kept ledgers and attendance lists written in coded language. To anyone who found them, the notes would seem harmless lists of recipes, book titles, or charitable donations. But between the lines were the real records, the number of women who had found peace, the names of those too afraid to attend, the addresses of doctors who could be trusted. Over time, these quiet circles formed a network that spanned cities, from London to Bath, from Liverpool to Edinburgh. Women who had never met shared the same unspoken promise of silence. They passed information like prayer, memorizing instead of writing. Some of them developed what they called the ritual of stillness, a shared exercise meant to calm the nerves before their sessions. It involved slow breathing, folded hands, and eyes closed to the world, a parody of prayer that replaced faith in God with faith in the self. The husbands, of course, noticed changes. Their wives seemed happier, calmer, and strangely confident. Some men were grateful and said nothing. Others grew suspicious, unable to explain the serenity they saw. They asked questions, and the women smiled and replied that they had found comfort in faith or friendship. It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth either. Beneath their modest dresses, these women carried a secret that made them untouchable. For once, they were the ones who possessed knowledge that men did not. The doctors who had started the treatments could not have imagined what they had created. Their invention had escaped their control. What began as a therapy had become a sisterhood. The women no longer needed permission or instruction. They taught each other. The tools that men had built for medical reasons now served a different purpose. They restored a sense of belonging, and that, perhaps, was the most threatening thing of all. It is almost poetic that an empire obsessed with order was undone, piece by piece, by the quiet organization of its women. As the years passed, the secrecy only deepened. The groups grew more selective, their rituals more deliberate. Some began to meet on specific dates, aligning their sessions with the moon's cycles or holidays, as if creating a calendar of devotion. Their gatherings were hidden behind locked doors and layers of civility. They spoke of nerves and recovery, but what they were truly curing was loneliness. The machines were only part of the treatment. The rest came from the knowledge that they were seen, understood, and believed. In these hidden circles, something powerful and irreversible had begun. The women no longer waited for doctors, priests, or husbands to grant them peace. They had learned to give it to themselves and to each other. Their laughter echoed softly through rooms heavy with perfume and candlelight, carrying a promise that no authority could erase. They had found healing not in medicine, but in unity, and their secret clubs became sanctuaries of quiet rebellion that history almost forgot to record. By the time the first whispers of unease began to circulate through the medical halls of London, it was already too late. The treatment that had begun as a harmless cure for female nerves had taken on a life of its own. Clinics were thriving, patients were returning with renewed devotion, and doctors found themselves both praised and feared. The very success of the therapy had become its danger. Physicians who once prided themselves on discipline began to notice something strange in their patients. The women were no longer meek, grateful figures but restless, demanding, and insatiably curious about their own bodies. What the doctors had awakened could not be easily silenced. Some among them grew uneasy. They spoke in private meetings, wondering whether they had gone too far. A few tried to stop offering the treatment altogether, claiming moral discomfort or professional fatigue. But the decision brought chaos. The women who had come weekly now wept and pleaded, their letters filled with desperation. Some appeared at the doctors' homes, trembling and incoherent, demanding another session. Others accused their physicians of cruelty for withholding what they called their only relief. It is almost tragic how quickly compassion turns to addiction when the body mistakes pleasure for medicine. There were cases of hysteria more violent than before. Women smashed mirrors, tore their clothes, and screamed for help that no one could give. Families panicked and called priests or asylum keepers. The doctors who had withdrawn were blamed for neglect, as if they had starved their patients of something essential. Reports described fainting fits, insomnia, and sudden rage. To the public, it looked like madness spreading among women. To the physicians who understood, it was withdrawal. They'd created a dependence they could neither justify nor control. A few medical journals tried to rationalize it. They claimed that some women were too sensitive, that their nerves could not handle frequent stimulation. The language grew cold, detached, as if emotional ruin could be charted like a fever. But beneath the surface, fear was growing. The therapy that once promised order was breeding chaos. The more doctors tried to distance themselves, the more unpredictable their patients became. Some women followed their former physicians through the streets, waiting outside offices, sending letters full of pleading and anger. A few even broke into clinics at night, insisting they could not live without treatment. The scandal deepened when several doctors confessed privately to being threatened. One man wrote that his patient had appeared at his home, pale and trembling, whispering that she would rather die than lose the sessions. He turned her away, and days later she was found wandering the city, delirious and barefoot. The newspapers called her another case of hysteria, but the truth was far more complicated. It was not sickness that consumed her, but the sudden absence of something that had become her only comfort. If it happened in modern times, it would be like doctors abruptly cutting off a prescription that had become the very definition of peace for those who relied on it. Rumours began to spread among the medical community. Some claimed that women were manipulating their doctors for attention, others that the therapy itself had corrupted them. A few dared to suggest that the women had simply learned what men had always known: that desire, once awakened, refuses to be buried again. Those words were considered scandalous, yet they carried a truth no one wished to admit. The doctors had tried to control something far older and stronger than their instruments. In their arrogance, they had mistaken repression for a cure. The moral panic that followed was swift. Churches condemned the practice, newspapers hinted at moral decay, and politicians debated whether to regulate the treatment more strictly. Yet none of these actions addressed the real issue. The women were not ill in the traditional sense. They were starved of recognition, of understanding, of touch that did not come with judgment. The therapy had filled that void, and once taken away, the emptiness returned sharper than before. Doctors could close their clinics, but they could not close what they had opened inside their patients. Some physicians tried to return to conventional treatments, prescribing tonics, rest, or even cold baths. None of it worked. The women had learned too much about what their bodies could feel. They could not unlearn it. They sat in offices with hollow eyes, pretending to listen while their minds replayed what they had lost. Their diaries turned darker, filled with confusion and grief. What had begun as relief had become torment, and the line between medicine and cruelty had vanished. A few doctors, perhaps out of guilt or fascination, continued their work in secret. They accepted only trusted patients, locking their doors and refusing to keep records. They told themselves it was mercy, not indulgence, but their consciences were heavy. They saw what others refused to see, that the therapy had changed women forever. These patients no longer sought healing. They sought meaning. They wanted to understand why the world allowed them only to feel through suffering or deception. The doctors had no answer. The strangest cases were those of obsession. Some women, once gentle and composed, began to fixate on their doctors. They followed them home, sent letters that blurred the line between gratitude and affection, and begged for private sessions. For the men who had always been the authority, it was a terrifying reversal. Power had shifted without warning. The patients who once obeyed now demanded, and the doctors who once prescribed now fled. It is unsettling how easily control crumbles when knowledge passes from one hand to another. By the end of the century, the hysteria cure had become a ghost in medical history, spoken of in whispers, erased from textbooks, and buried under polite phrases. But its legacy remained in the women it had changed. They were no longer the quiet figures of before. They had tasted something forbidden, and found it more honest than the lies they were raised to believe. And though the doctors tried to forget, the women never did. What they carried within them was not madness, but memory, and it would echo through every generation that followed. The morning it happened was grey and quiet, the kind of morning London barely notices. 4 women left their homes dressed neatly, as if heading to a social visit. Their coats were buttoned, their gloves spotless, their hair arranged with care. They walked separately through the narrow streets toward the same riverbank, each unaware of the other's precise steps but bound by a shared despair. When they reached the bridge, witnesses said they paused for only a moment before climbing the railing. Their movements were calm, almost graceful. Within minutes, the river swallowed them whole. It was over before anyone understood what they had seen. By nightfall, the story was already spreading. The police called it a coincidence. The newspapers described it as a strange and tragic episode, using words like hysteria and female melancholy. But those who knew the women saw something more deliberate. They had all been patients of the same private clinic, one that had recently been closed by order of the authorities. The official reason was moral impropriety. Unofficially, it was because the doctors had been accused of encouraging unwholesome dependency. The closure had left dozens of women without their treatments, and some, it seemed, could not bear the loss. In the drawers of their homes, letters were found. The handwriting trembled but remained careful, polite. Each one spoke of sleeplessness, of voices that would not quiet, of hearts that beat too fast. They wrote of needing the therapy again, of missing the peace it brought. Not one of them mentioned pleasure. They called it light, or rest, or stillness. The words repeated across their pages like prayers. It was clear that they did not wish to die, only to end the torment of living without what had once healed them. It is cruel how often society calls madness what is, in truth, unbearable loneliness. The doctors involved refused to speak publicly. Some resigned their positions, others left the city. The few who did comment described the incident as a tragic demonstration of female instability. They insisted that the treatment had always been harmless, that the women's actions were proof of their disorder, not of the therapy's power. It was easier to believe that the patients were unwell than to admit that something vital had been taken from them. To question that would have meant questioning the entire moral fabric of their world. The families were shamed into silence. The bodies were buried quietly, their names omitted from official records. The death certificates listed exhaustion or fever. The government, eager to preserve public order, labelled the event a shared episode of nervous confusion. No one wanted to say the truth aloud that these women had died because they had found something worth living for, and then it had been taken away. Their story was erased before it could ever be understood. If it happened today, it would be like erasing every trace of a scandal by calling it a misunderstanding and pretending no one ever existed. For the women who had once visited that clinic, fear settled deep. Many stopped their treatments immediately, terrified of being discovered. Others sought underground practitioners, risking their reputations for the chance of relief. A quiet panic rippled through drawing rooms and parlours. Letters between friends became coded, cautious. Phrases like our health club or our resting hour replaced the word therapy. The sound of laughter at gatherings grew sharper, forced. The tragedy had left a shadow that lingered in every room where women once whispered freely. Doctors faced their own unease. Some began to wonder whether they had ever truly understood what they were doing. They had claimed to cure hysteria but now saw only grief. The patients had not been mad. They had been alive for the first time, and then condemned for it. To the men of science, it was a lesson they could not afford to learn. Instead, they hid behind theories and statistics. They wrote of nervous contagion and feminine weakness, never daring to write of joy. In private, a few physicians wept. They had seen their patients smile in ways they could not explain, heard laughter that lingered long after the sessions ended. They had believed they were bringing comfort, not awakening. Now, the same faces that once glowed with gratitude haunted their memories. They could not forget the tremor of hands, the softness of voices saying thank you, the brief stillness that had felt almost holy. When the authorities closed their doors, it was not medicine that ended, but something human. The church called the tragedy divine punishment. Sermons warned women against seeking unnatural pleasures or trusting modern science. The word spread faster than the truth ever could. Households grew stricter, husbands watchful. The very thing that had offered relief had now become a symbol of shame. The empire congratulated itself for restoring order, never realizing that what it had truly restored was despair. Yet in quiet corners, women still remembered. They whispered the names of the 4 who had died, calling them not sinners, but martyrs of feeling. They lit candles for them in secret, sometimes beside their sewing machines or hidden boxes of medicine. These small gestures became acts of mourning and defiance. The flame flickered softly, reflecting in their eyes the same light those women had once described in their diaries, the light that had been their only freedom. The river kept its silence, as it always does. No plaque was ever placed, no poem written. The city moved on, as if nothing had happened. But among the women who lived through it, something changed. They understood now that the cure had never been about the body at all. It had been about belonging, about the right to feel alive in a world that refused to see them. And even as history tried to wash the story away, the current of what they had found still ran beneath everything, waiting to resurface again. The advertisements began to appear quietly, tucked between pages of embroidery patterns and domestic advice. The readers who opened their weekly women's magazines expected to find sewing tips, moral lessons, or stories about household harmony, but scattered among these were small, seemingly harmless articles with titles like For Restful Nights or Calming the Nerves. They spoke in gentle tones about modern science and female health, about new ways to manage exhaustion and sleeplessness. The words were polite, the tone clinical, yet something beneath the surface felt different. Those who understood smiled faintly. The message was clear to anyone who had ever visited a certain kind of doctor. The phrase nerve relaxation became the perfect disguise. It sounded respectable, even virtuous. These magazines never mentioned pleasure, never hinted at anything improper, but the subtext was unmistakable. Readers were told of therapeutic devices for home use, of mechanical aids for nervous distress, of aiding circulation for calm repose. The descriptions were just vague enough to avoid suspicion and just detailed enough to spark curiosity. Illustrations showed women sitting gracefully beside curious machines, their hands resting lightly on brass handles or water pipes. The faces were always serene, eyes downcast, lips parted slightly as if in quiet relief. It is fascinating how language can hide the truth in plain sight, turning desire into decorum with a single phrase. For the women who had lost access to clinics, these articles were lifelines. They clipped them carefully, folded them into letters, or read them aloud to trusted friends. The advertisements promised home comfort and modern progress, but everyone knew what they truly offered. The editors understood their audience perfectly. They had found a way to sell forbidden comfort while keeping their hands clean. Even the delivery instructions were coded. Customers were advised to request the portable nerve regulator or the domestic hydrotherapy kit. The items arrived in plain boxes, labelled as medical equipment. Husbands saw them and assumed nothing more than another household expense. The market for these devices grew rapidly. By the mid-1890s, nearly every women's publication had at least one page dedicated to wellness and vitality. There were reviews comparing different models, tips on cleaning, and even letters from supposed readers praising the relief they brought. The letters were often anonymous, signed only with initials, but the tone was unmistakably sincere. After months of sleeplessness, I now rest peacefully each night, wrote one woman. My energy has returned, and my spirits are much improved, claimed another. It was a public exchange of secrets disguised as medical testimony. The illustrations that accompanied these articles were works of art in deception. Some showed women reclining in fainting chairs, their eyes closed, their bodies relaxed in poses that skirted the edge of propriety. Others depicted a simple drawing of a machine beside a vase of flowers, as if to suggest the harmony of technology and femininity. The cleverness lay in the restraint. The images revealed nothing yet implied everything. The readers did not need more. Their imaginations filled in the silence. If it happened today, it would be like wellness influencers recommending devices that promise sleep but sell something far less innocent. Publishers insisted that their magazines were educational, that they supported women's health and domestic harmony. But behind the polished covers, the editors were fully aware of what they were printing. Sales rose dramatically. Every issue seemed to vanish from bookstalls within days. Printers began to add special supplements on scientific self-care, claiming to educate women about anatomy and hygiene. Between diagrams of muscles and bones, there were always small, inconspicuous references to mechanical stimulation for vitality. The lines between instruction and suggestion blurred completely. Doctors condemned these publications in private, but few dared to challenge them publicly. They depended on the same readership for their patients. To criticize the magazines too strongly would expose their own involvement in the history of the devices. Some physicians even contributed articles themselves, describing the benefits of domestic treatment for mild nervous exhaustion. Their words lent legitimacy to the trade while ensuring that the truth remained hidden behind layers of respectability. For the women reading these magazines, the experience was both thrilling and comforting. They no longer felt isolated or ashamed. Each new issue confirmed that others like them existed, that their needs were shared by countless others. The coded language united them in silent understanding. They began to form small reading groups, pretending to discuss literature while passing around pages torn from the latest issue. The magazines had become more than publications. They were maps of survival, guiding readers through the narrow corridors of moral expectation. Some articles even offered advice on how to introduce the devices to skeptical husbands. Explain it as a medical recommendation, one suggested. Demonstrate how it aids sleep and soothes the nerves. The tone was always practical, never suggestive. The brilliance of the disguise lay in its simplicity. No one could accuse a woman of sin for following a doctor's advice, even if that advice came printed on glossy pages beside advertisements for teacups and perfume. The line between science and secrecy was thinner than the paper itself. The government briefly considered censoring such material, but the effort faltered. There was no law against selling medical equipment or publishing information about it. And so the coded conversation continued, slipping past every barrier with the elegance of a whisper. These magazines gave women the one thing the world refused them: a language to describe their own bodies without shame. They turned commerce into communication, silence into connection. It is both absurd and extraordinary that an empire's most discreet rebellion could be carried out through something as ordinary as a fashion magazine. When the century turned, the advertisements remained, though the machines evolved and the language softened further. Rejuvenation, circulation, restful mind. The words changed, but the message stayed the same. For women across drawing rooms and factory towns alike, these pages became a mirror, reflecting their quiet hunger for peace and control. The magazines promised health, but delivered something far more important: recognition. And for many, that was enough to keep reading, clipping, and believing. Addiction in the Victorian world did not always come from a bottle or a pipe. For some women, it began in the quiet hours behind locked doors, in moments that blurred the line between medicine and desire. What started as treatment became ritual, and what began as relief turned into necessity. The women who once trembled under the weight of restraint now trembled for another reason entirely. They were no longer seeking a cure, but continuation, a way to keep feeling alive in a life that demanded stillness. Their doctors had called it therapy for the nerves. In truth, it had become their only source of joy. The word addiction was never used. It was too crude, too shameful for polite conversation. Instead, they spoke of maintaining health, of keeping balance, of avoiding relapse. Yet the signs were unmistakable. The hands that once trembled from anxiety now shook from anticipation. Some women scheduled their treatments several times a day, carefully timing them between meals, visitors, and errands. The devices that sat quietly in their rooms were as necessary to them as air. The first hum of vibration brought calm, the second brought release, and the third felt like prayer. It is strange how easily the search for peace becomes the habit of escape, when life offers nothing softer to hold on to. Many wrote about it in secret journals. Their words carried both shame and devotion. They described the calm afterward, the heaviness in their limbs, the strange glow that lingered long into the evening. One woman called it a renewal of spirit, another the moment when my body forgives me. None of them believed they were doing anything wrong. They saw it as a kind of medicine for the soul, a necessity for survival in a world that starved them of comfort. Their guilt existed only when they imagined being caught, never when they closed their eyes and breathed freely again. The women who relied on these rituals began to form patterns familiar to any addict. They hid their devices, locked drawers, and feigned illness when their supplies broke. A few travelled across towns to find repair shops that would ask no questions. Others bribed servants to keep secrets. They learned to clean and maintain the machines with the care of chemists. Their precision was born not from luxury, but from fear. To lose the ability to feel, even for a day, was to return to the cold emptiness they had escaped. If it happened today, it would be like replacing a drug with something invisible, something respectable enough to hide behind the language of self-care. For many, the craving became both comfort and curse. The moments of release were followed by deep fatigue, an ache that reached beyond the body. Some described crying afterward without understanding why. It was as if their emotions had been shaken loose from years of silence and now had nowhere to go. The therapy that once calmed them now consumed them. They began to crave the sensation not out of pleasure, but because it made them feel real. It was the only time they could sense their heartbeat as their own. Doctors noticed the pattern but refused to name it. They could not admit that their invention had replaced one addiction with another. Some recommended limiting sessions, prescribing strict schedules, but few women obeyed. They laughed politely during consultations and continued in private. To deny themselves the therapy felt like denying life itself. They were not chasing thrill, they were chasing presence. In their minds, they were not ill. They were awake, perhaps too awake for a world that demanded numbness. Society, of course, remained blind. It saw only well-dressed women who seemed calmer than before, unaware of the storms that brewed beneath their corsets. These were not drunkards or opium eaters, so no one questioned their purity. The empire loved appearances, and these women had mastered the art of seeming serene. Yet their serenity was built on trembling hands and secret moments that no one would ever witness. They wore their calm like armour, hiding behind the fragrance of rosewater and the whisper of machinery beneath silk. Some grew bold in their solitude. They began to speak to one another about the experience, calling it a gift of science. They claimed that regular therapy improved their mood, their sleep, and even their marriages. In truth, it was less about improvement and more about survival. They had learned that the body's smallest rebellion could become its greatest comfort. The feeling of control, of being both the patient and the doctor, was intoxicating. They were no longer waiting to be touched by permission. They were granting themselves the right to feel. The moralists, when they finally noticed, called it degradation. They accused women of indulging in vanity and sin. But these judgments came from those who had never known the weight of being told to sit still, to smile, to be pure. The women did not answer. They knew that words could not defend what the body already knew to be sacred. Their silence was not guilt, it was protection. Within that quiet lay the understanding that this strange new dependence was not on pleasure, but on being. It is almost unbearable to realize that for some, The only proof of existence came from the brief trembling between life and guilt. The addiction did not destroy them, at least not in the way others imagined. It did not leave scars or ruin reputations. It left something subtler, a restlessness, a hunger that no sermon or social gathering could fill. They smiled at dinners, nodded through prayers, and waited for the moment when they could return to their solitude. The therapy, the machines, the rituals, they were not tools of sin but of endurance. In a society that demanded silence, these women had found a way to survive the noise of emptiness. Their secret became their salvation, and their salvation became their dependence. Each vibration, each sigh, each moment of trembling reminded them that beneath their layers of propriety and exhaustion, something inside them was still alive. And though the world would never forgive them for finding comfort in their own hands, they no longer cared. The addiction had become faith, and the faith had become the only truth left to believe. By the turn of the century, a quiet inheritance began to pass from one generation of women to the next. It did not involve jewels, property, or letters of lineage. It was something far more intimate and more carefully guarded. In sitting rooms filled with lace curtains and the faint scent of lavender, grandmothers and mothers began to speak in hushed tones to the younger women of their families. The conversations happened late at night, when the rest of the house was asleep. There were no books, no open instructions, only gestures, glances, and the slow rhythm of words chosen with care. The subject was not named directly, yet everyone understood. It was the art of self-control within pleasure, the discipline of calm before joy. The elder woman spoke with the tone of those who had lived long enough to understand the difference between sin and survival. They told their daughters and granddaughters that every woman must learn how to take care of herself in a world that would not. They did not use the language of rebellion, but of endurance. You must never let anyone else decide when you are at peace, one might say, though peace meant something far more physical than spiritual. These lessons were delivered with the same gravity as teaching prayer or needlework. The knowledge had become domestic, woven into womanhood itself. It is strangely beautiful how rebellion can hide within tenderness and be passed on as love. Some of these teachings were symbolic, spoken through metaphors of breath and posture. Others were practical. The women discussed how to prepare the room, how to find stillness, and how to let the body soften without guilt. They taught that control was not about denial, but about rhythm, about knowing when to stop and when to allow. Their words carried the precision of survival, shaped by decades of silence. To the younger women, the idea was shocking at first, but the gentleness in the elders' voices turned shame into curiosity. In many homes, the heirlooms of this unspoken tradition were physical objects: a small wooden box, wrapped in a faded scarf, a brass instrument hidden inside a drawer, carefully polished though never mentioned. Some women even wrote instructions on folded paper, disguised as notes about medicine. A few went so far as to include their cherished devices in their wills, referring to them not as machines but as tokens of rest. Their families might not have understood, but the women who received them did. They touched the metal with reverence, as if holding a blessing. If it happened today, it would be like a grandmother passing down a secret diary of peace, one written in a language the world still refuses to read. These acts of inheritance were not driven by scandal but by compassion. The older woman had seen too much pain, too many tears shed for things that should never have been shameful. They wanted their daughters to live without the fear that had followed them. For them, the device was not a symbol of lust, but of survival. It represented choice in a life where so little could be chosen. They did not see it as indulgence, but as a kind of protection, a form of spiritual armour against despair. In letters that survived from that time, there are faint traces of this quiet education. A grandmother wrote to her granddaughter about finding calm through warmth and rhythm. Another wrote of moments of stillness that remind us we belong to ourselves. The language was vague, soft, and filled with metaphors, yet unmistakable. These women were creating a lineage of emotional resilience disguised as modest advice. Their love had taken the shape of wisdom too dangerous to speak plainly. Not every family kept the secret. Some burned the devices out of fear, calling them dangerous relics of sin. But in many homes, the tradition continued quietly. Mothers whispered to daughters before their weddings, warning them not only of duty but of the importance of knowing their own hearts. Some even encouraged their daughters to use the devices as medicine for sadness or sleeplessness. The boundaries between body and soul blurred gently, and the result was a generation of women who felt a little less afraid of themselves. The moralists would have been horrified had they known. They imagined vice and corruption spreading through respectable homes. But what truly spread was understanding. The elder women were not teaching decadence, they were teaching peace. They were giving their descendants the right to kindness toward themselves. It was the only form of inheritance that no law could confiscate and no man could claim. It was freedom passed hand to hand under the veil of propriety. As time went on, this tradition became quieter still, hidden beneath new technologies and new taboos, but it never disappeared. In every generation, a few women remembered. A mother might find her grandmother's box while cleaning, or a granddaughter might uncover an old note folded between pages of a prayer book. The discovery always came with a strange sense of connection, as if the past were reaching out through silence to remind her that she was not alone. The empire would record its inventions, its wars, its kings, but not this inheritance. History would forget the women who passed it down, yet their legacy endured in small gestures and secret knowledge. Each act of quiet instruction was a spark that refused to die, a whisper reminding the next generation that the body's truth was not shame but survival. It is both tender and tragic that in teaching their daughters how to endure, these women were also teaching them how to live. And so the devices became more than machines. They became relics of love, carried forward in silence. The women who taught these lessons never called it passion or desire. They called it spiritual defense, a private form of grace. And within those words, they preserved the oldest truth of all, that even in a world built to silence them, women will always find a way to speak. In the polished streets of late Victorian London, where every window was trimmed and every curtain drawn to hide the smallest hint of scandal, an unusual lawsuit quietly made its way through the courts. It was not about property, money, or defamation. It was about disappointment of a most peculiar kind. A woman had accused her doctor of professional failure, not because he had harmed her, but because his treatment had not worked as promised. Her complaint, though wrapped in polite medical language, was unmistakable. The therapy had not brought her to the relief she had been told to expect. The newspapers hinted at nervous treatment malpractice, but everyone knew what that meant. Behind the refined words lay the truth that few dared to say aloud. The woman came from a respectable family. Her husband was often away, her social calendar was busy, and her nerves were said to be fragile. She had tried every fashionable remedy, mineral water, opium drops, long walks in gardens. Nothing soothed her restlessness until she heard of a doctor who specialized in what he called manual neuromuscular stimulation therapy. Friends whispered that his hands worked wonders. Women who had visited him left his office serene, almost glowing. So she went, expecting the same transformation. But after several sessions, she felt nothing but frustration. The tension remained, and the promised calm never came. She concluded, quite seriously, that the doctor was incompetent. The complaint she filed was written with clinical precision. It accused the physician of failing to deliver the expected physical reaction. The words unsuccessful procedure appeared several times. What might have been a private embarrassment soon became public curiosity. It is rather absurd that a doctor could be sued for not producing an orgasm. Yet in Victorian England, absurdity was often hidden behind formality. When the case reached the press, reporters struggled to describe it without crossing the line of decency. The terms nervous relief, pelvic therapy, and female circulation treatment appeared in articles that danced around the truth. The editors added moral reflections about the dangers of over-medicalizing emotion, but everyone reading between the lines understood what had happened. Parlours and drawing rooms buzzed with speculation. Women giggled behind fans. Men frowned and asked too many questions. Doctors pretended to be offended but secretly feared what such a case might reveal about their profession. The accused doctor, a man known for his discretion, appeared humiliated. He insisted that his work was purely therapeutic and that outcomes varied from patient to patient, yet his embarrassment was only part of the spectacle. The real drama unfolded in the quiet conversations that followed. If the woman's claim was valid, then pleasure itself had become a legal expectation. Medicine and morality had collided in a way the Victorians could hardly process. Some saw the case as a sign of corruption among doctors. Others viewed it as a symptom of moral decay among women. But the deeper truth was far simpler. The lawsuit exposed how normalized these treatments had become. What began as a supposed cure for hysteria had turned into a service that women demanded with the same confidence as they would a haircut or a massage. It is almost funny to think how a society that forbade female desire in public had turned it into a private appointment on a physician's schedule. Behind the laughter, however, lay discomfort. If women could sue for not being satisfied, then satisfaction itself had become a measure of professional success. That was a concept both thrilling and terrifying to the male establishment. For centuries, women's pleasure had been dismissed, medicalized, or condemned. Now it had been documented, priced, and judged in court. The boundaries between science, sin, and commerce blurred entirely. The trial, brief as it was, never led to punishment. The case was dismissed on grounds of inappropriate subject matter, yet the story spread faster than any ruling could contain it. The woman who filed the claim was whispered about at tea parties, and the doctor quietly left the city. Within weeks, pamphlets appeared mocking the situation. Cartoonists drew images of fainting women surrounded by stethoscopes and fans. The satire was gentle but revealing. Society laughed to disguise its unease. For many women, the story confirmed what they already knew but could not say. The medical profession was not neutral. It had become a theatre of control, curiosity, and dependency. The lawsuit was merely the first public crack in the illusion that these treatments were purely clinical. It showed that beneath the polite layers of medicine lay the raw human desire for connection, comfort, and validation. A few female reformers used the incident to argue for a better understanding of women's bodies and emotions. They wrote essays under pseudonyms, suggesting that education, not medical intervention, was the true cure for hysteria. These writings were quietly circulated among women's groups but dismissed by male scholars as overly emotional. The irony was almost unbearable. After the scandal faded, doctors became more cautious. They replaced their manual techniques with machines, citing efficiency and hygiene. But the underlying expectation remained unchanged. Women still sought the same release, and the industry still profited from it. The lawsuit had not ended the practice. It had simply moved it further underground. It fascinates me how a single act of defiance can reveal the hypocrisy of an entire era. The woman who dared to complain was ridiculed. Yet in her complaint lay a kind of honesty the Victorian world could not tolerate. She demanded not only treatment but recognition of her body's truth. In doing so, she became an accidental rebel in a society built on silence. The courtroom may have forgotten her name, but the echo of her accusation lingered. It whispered through the walls of parlours and clinics, reminding those who heard it that even the most repressed societies cannot fully erase human need. What she set in motion would not end with her. Others were already listening, already learning, already preparing to take what they had been told to deny. The growing popularity of these so-called therapeutic devices did not escape the attention of the Church. In a society that claimed morality as its foundation, whispers of pleasure disguised as medicine soon reached the pulpits. Sermons began to thunder against the decay of womanly virtue. Yet even the most outspoken priests struggled to define exactly what they were condemning. To name it would mean describing it, and to describe it would mean admitting that women were capable of desire. So they preached in circles, warning against temptation without ever saying what the temptation was. It was a remarkable balancing act to rage against sin without daring to identify it. The Church framed the growing fascination with treatment as a kind of spiritual sickness. Priests called it the soft invasion of the devil, a corruption creeping into the home through the hands of doctors. Pamphlets warned women to guard their purity from false medicine, yet no one dared print what the medicine actually did. It was easier to say that demons whispered through machines than to admit that the human body could tremble from something other than fear. The contradiction was almost poetic in its hypocrisy. Women were told to obey God, but not their own flesh, as if the two could ever be separated. In confession booths, the lines grew longer. Wives wept and trembled as they tried to explain feelings that even priests could not name. Some were told to fast, to pray, to bathe in cold water. Others were given rosaries to keep their hands busy. Still, the unease returned, stronger each time. The Church did not realize it was fighting not the devil, but nature itself. It is rather funny that what they feared as possession was often just relief. Behind closed doors, women listened to sermons about purity while the devices hummed quietly in their bedrooms. Candles flickered beside crucifixes, and the contradictions deepened. Some women prayed before treatment, asking forgiveness for what they were about to do. Others prayed after, asking the same thing. It became a strange ritual of guilt and release, sanctified by silence. The Church could not touch what it refused to understand, and so its moral power weakened each day. In public, bishops spoke of a great threat to female modesty. They framed it as an issue of spiritual decay rather than physical curiosity. But the message grew confusing. How could women be both fragile saints and dangerous seductresses? How could the same body be praised for its virtue and cursed for its sensations? The Church's language, once absolute, began to crumble under its own contradictions. The more it tried to contain female desire, the more it exposed its fear of it. Newspapers, ever eager to profit from scandal, began quoting priests warning that evil may reside in the hum of machines. Illustrations of faceless women kneeling before mysterious contraptions filled the pages, but the warnings backfired. Curiosity grew. If the Church feared these devices so much, they must be powerful indeed. Sales quietly increased. It is strange how fear, when shouted loudly enough, can sound like an advertisement. Not all women obeyed the warnings. Many continued their treatments, but with an added sense of rebellion. What had once been a medical routine now carried the thrill of forbidden ritual. Some even confessed to feeling closer to God afterward, claiming the release brought clarity and calm. Such statements horrified priests but revealed an undeniable truth for many. Pleasure felt more divine than sin. Meanwhile, the Church began to police even the language surrounding the body. Words like nerve, relief, and stimulation were scrutinized for indecency. Doctors received anonymous letters urging them to abandon their corrupt science. But medicine had already taken root among the upper classes, and what the rich embraced, no priest could banish. The pulpit, once the heart of authority, was slowly losing to the hum of machines hidden beneath lace and linen. This quiet defiance reshaped the spiritual landscape. Religion had always dictated what a woman could confess, but now there were things she would not confess at all. Faith became something to perform in daylight, while at night the flesh wrote its own prayers. The Church had built its power on shame, but shame was slipping through its fingers. Each sermon only confirmed to women how little the clergy understood their lives. For the first time, the Church's moral code met a rival that could not be punished or excommunicated. Desire had no name in its doctrine, so it could not be destroyed. What began as whispered gossip in drawing rooms had grown into a quiet revolution of the senses. It was invisible, yet everywhere, and no amount of incense or chanting could cleanse it away. By the late Victorian years, religious leaders found themselves trapped. To continue condemning the devices would mean acknowledging their existence. To ignore them would mean surrendering control. They did both at once, preaching louder while pretending nothing was happening. The result was absurd, a moral theatre where everyone knew the script but no one dared speak their lines aloud. The divide between body and soul had never felt so wide. Women were told salvation lay in denial, yet what they found through these treatments was peace, even if fleeting. The irony was painful. The very institution that preached healing for the soul had declared war on the body's own medicine. Faith still ruled the public voice of the era, but beneath it ran an undercurrent stronger than prayer. It was not rebellion in the streets, but in the bedroom, soft and silent, driven by something older than Scripture. The church may have thought it was protecting virtue, but it was, in truth, defending ignorance, and ignorance was no longer enough. The sermons faded, but the questions remained. Morality no longer seemed so certain, and obedience began to feel hollow. Somewhere between the hymns and the hum of hidden machines, the meaning of purity itself began to dissolve, leaving only the quiet pulse of a new kind of faith. In their struggle to define sin, the priests had accidentally defined freedom. It was not a revolution of fire and protest, but of breath and silence. And while the church fought to keep control, it never realized it had already lost it. The faith of a nation stood trembling, just like the women it had tried so hard to silence. The next wave of fear would not come from the pulpit, but from the men whose authority at home was starting to waver. As women's treatments continued behind closed doors, an unease began to grow among Victorian men. Husbands noticed the subtle changes first. Their wives, once anxious or withdrawn, appeared strangely serene. The tension that had filled so many homes seemed to vanish overnight, replaced by an air of quiet composure. Yet there was something unfamiliar in that calmness, something that unsettled them. It was not devotion, not gratitude, but a kind of independence that no husband could quite explain. It is almost amusing how men can sense power slipping away long before they understand where it has gone. The domestic order of Victorian life had always relied on predictability. Wives were meant to fuss, to tire easily, to depend on their husbands for guidance and reassurance. When they stopped doing so, questions arose. Some men began to suspect infidelity, though there were no secret letters or late-night meetings to uncover. The women were always home, polite and attentive. Yet behind that politeness, something had shifted. Theirs was a composure born of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the men in their lives. Rumours drifted through gentlemen's clubs and taverns, whispers about new therapies for women's nerves, about doctors performing indecent acts under medical guise, and about strange humming contraptions appearing in private homes. The gossip carried the sting of humiliation. To the men, it was not the act itself that offended them, but the idea that their wives could find relief without them. Victorian masculinity, fragile beneath its pomp, could not bear such an insult. Some husbands confronted their wives, pressing for details, but the answers they received were infuriatingly vague. The women spoke of health, of treatments prescribed for nervous exhaustion. There was nothing to object to, nothing explicitly indecent. The language of medicine was their shield, and men, though suspicious, dared not question it too deeply. To do so would mean admitting they did not understand the female body, a humiliation no gentleman wished to endure. It feels oddly familiar, how pride can silence reason more effectively than fear ever could. Behind closed doors, the devices were hidden in drawers or beneath layers of lace. Some women wrapped them in handkerchiefs, others stored them with their sewing kits. They were careful not to leave evidence, not out of shame, but out of caution. A discovery would lead to awkward explanations neither husband nor wife truly wanted to have. The home, Once the man's domain had become a theatre of secrets. Even the silence had a rhythm now, a quiet hum that men could not hear but somehow felt. Doctors were careful too. They reassured anxious husbands that the treatments were purely therapeutic, that everything was respectable. They used medical jargon as armour, transforming intimacy into anatomy, desire into diagnosis. It was a brilliant illusion, one that men accepted because it maintained their dignity. To believe their wives were being treated as patients was far less disturbing than imagining them as beings with desires beyond control. In drawing rooms, women exchanged knowing glances over tea. They spoke of nerves and health, of rest and sleep, while their husbands discussed politics and the price of coal. The two worlds coexisted in the same house, yet never touched. The women's laughter seemed lighter, the air around them less burdened. The men, meanwhile, began to feel an invisible distance widening across the table. What they did not know was that it was not distance at all, it was liberation. The shift was quiet but seismic. The authority of the husband, so long considered divine order, was being undone by the most unthreatening of objects. Men could enforce rules, write laws, and command armies, but they could not compete with the subtle reassurance of pleasure disguised as medicine. They could not fight what they could not name. Some tried to forbid the treatments, but the prohibition only deepened their wives' determination. It was not rebellion in the traditional sense, but something more profound, a refusal to surrender one's body to another's control. Among the upper classes, the confusion grew worse. Husbands who prided themselves on sophistication could not understand how this quiet epidemic had spread so far. They read reports of therapeutic progress in medical journals, never realizing that these advancements were not for them. They praised innovation while losing authority over the one place they had always ruled, the bedroom. The irony would have been delicious had it not been so tragic to them. The women were not malicious. They were not plotting to overthrow their husbands or disgrace them. They simply found something that restored what the rigid moral codes had stolen. Their calmness, their newfound peace, was a side effect of freedom. And freedom, once tasted, could not be returned to the shelf like a bottle of medicine. Some men sensed this instinctively. They did not need to see the devices to know they had lost their monopoly on intimacy. The subtle gestures of distance, the half smile, the measured politeness, the sudden lack of need, told them everything. In private, some turned bitter, others simply confused. Victorian masculinity had built itself on being indispensable. Now it found itself quietly dismissed. As society continued to parade its moral purity, homes became the stage for a quiet inversion of power. The more control men asserted outside, the less they seemed to have within their walls. They could lecture about honour and faith, but those words sounded hollow against the soft hum of machines and the sighs they could not hear. It is strange how power does not always fall with noise. Sometimes it fades in silence, unnoticed until it is gone. What slipped through men's fingers in those years was not affection or respect, but authority itself, and when they finally realized what had replaced it, it was far too late to reclaim. The illusion of dominance had cracked. What began as suspicion would soon turn into obsession, as men searched for proof of their fading influence. Yet the real threat was never in the machines. It was in the awakening of women who no longer needed permission to feel alive. When women first entered medicine, the profession barely tolerated their presence. They were allowed to heal children, assist midwives, and care for the poor, but they were rarely trusted with authority. Yet from within that narrow space, something remarkable began to grow. The few women who studied anatomy and physiology realized that the male doctor's obsession with treating female nerves had less to do with science and more to do with control. What men had disguised as medicine. These new women doctors began to recognize for what it truly was, the reclamation of the female body. It must have been quite a shock for the men to see their patients become their colleagues and then their rivals. The early female physicians approached their work differently. They spoke softly to their patients, listened to them, and did not treat their discomfort as madness. Instead of labeling them hysterical, they asked questions about loneliness, exhaustion, and repression. They saw patterns that the men had missed, or perhaps ignored. Many women did not suffer from illness but from deprivation, both emotional and physical. The treatment they needed was not silence, but understanding. These new doctors did not entirely reject the existing therapies. They simply changed their meaning. Instead of performing them as a service for men to profit from, they began to teach women how to care for themselves. Manuals circulated privately, written in coded language about autonomous therapy and self-regulation. At public lectures, they used careful phrasing to avoid scandal, describing their lessons as exercises in health and relaxation. Yet every woman in the room knew what they truly meant. It was an education in ownership of one's body, one's sensations, one's peace. In drawing rooms and rented halls, they gathered small groups of women for instruction. Candles burned low, curtains were drawn, and the air carried the faint scent of lavender oil. The atmosphere was not one of shame, but of curiosity. The doctors spoke about anatomy with precision and gentleness, explaining what no man had ever cared to explain. They spoke of muscles, nerves, and blood flow as natural phenomena, not moral hazards. For many women, it was the first time they heard their own bodies described without disgust. The more these teachings spread, the more threatened the male establishment became. Newspapers mocked the women doctors as indecent or delusional. Pamphlets accused them of corrupting virtue and undermining marriage. But ridicule could not stop the momentum. Students flocked to their lectures. Housewives wrote letters seeking advice. Even some male physicians secretly asked for copies of their notes, hoping to understand what their patients now preferred about women practitioners. The tide had begun to turn. In private practice, female doctors offered alternatives to the humiliating visits to male surgeons. Women no longer had to undress under the gaze of men who saw their bodies as curiosities. Now they could speak openly, describe their symptoms, and be treated with respect. The results were astonishing. Patients not only recovered faster but also left with a newfound sense of self-worth. For the first time, healing and dignity occupied the same space. This quiet revolution extended beyond medicine. The conversations that began in those clinics spilled into salons, tea circles, and literary societies. Women started to write essays and memoirs about the link between physical well-being and freedom. The idea that pleasure could exist without sin, that it might even serve health, began to spread among educated circles. Though many still whispered, the whispering grew louder with every passing year. The women leading this movement faced immense pressure. Some were expelled from hospitals, others lost funding or reputations, but their perseverance was relentless. They argued that female suffering had been prolonged by ignorance and moral hypocrisy. They insisted that to heal a woman's mind, one must first stop punishing her body. That statement alone was revolutionary enough to unsettle centuries of dogma. It is almost tragic how long it took medicine to realize that compassion works better than control. As their influence grew, so did the sense of solidarity among patients. Women who once came to the clinic in secrecy began to arrive in groups. They shared stories, exchanged experiences, and even pooled money to fund clinics led by female practitioners. Each visit became a quiet act of rebellion. The medical establishment could no longer pretend that this was a fringe movement. It was a cultural shift taking shape under their noses. By the 1890s, the language of medicine had changed. Words like hysteria began to disappear from medical textbooks, replaced with terms that reflected physical causes rather than moral weakness. Behind those linguistic changes were the tireless efforts of women who refused to let history silence them again. They had turned the tools once used to control them into instruments of liberation. Of course, not everyone approved. Religious leaders accused them of blasphemy. Politicians dismissed them as radicals. But the women doctors did not seek permission, they sought truth. They understood that change did not always need to be loud. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in a clinic lit by candlelight, where a woman finally learned to understand her own heartbeat. This transformation did not make every woman free, but it made freedom imaginable. Knowledge became power, and that power spread in whispers from one generation to the next. What had begun as a medical correction was slowly evolving into a social awakening. The men who had once ruled the field began to realize that their monopoly on both medicine and morality was dissolving. Their patients were not returning. Their authority, once unquestioned, was now being replaced by empathy and experience, and empathy, unlike fear, could not be outlawed. The age of hysteria was ending, but something new and more radical was beginning to rise from its ashes. Women no longer needed to be saved. They were learning to save themselves. The next story would not belong to doctors or priests at all, but to the inventors who dared to turn rebellion into creation. In the final decades of the Victorian era, invention was worshipped as the new god. Every week, newspapers announced some new marvel, an engine that could move faster, a light that could burn brighter, a machine that could mimic life itself. Amid the noise of industrial progress, one invention quietly slipped through the cracks of respectability. It did not power a train or light a city, yet it gave countless women something they had never been allowed to claim before. It was small, discreet, and ran on coal. Its inventor was not a famous engineer or wealthy patron, but an elderly woman who worked in her husband's workshop. It is oddly poetic that the most revolutionary Victorian invention fit beneath a petticoat rather than inside a factory. The woman's name was largely forgotten, replaced by whispers and nicknames. Some called her the grandmother of sparks, others simply the quiet mechanic. Her husband repaired sewing machines for a living, and it was while cleaning one that she noticed how the motor created a steady vibration. From curiosity came experimentation. She replaced the wheel, added a lever, and attached a small compartment for coal heating. The device, barely larger than a hand, produced a continuous rhythmic pulse. To her, it was a harmless curiosity. To the women who would later own it, it was salvation disguised as machinery. At first, she used it to soothe her aching joints, a common ailment among the elderly. But word spread quickly when a visiting neighbour borrowed it and returned glowing, saying it cured her nervous exhaustion. Soon, others came knocking, women from the village who claimed they suffered from sleeplessness and fatigue. The old woman, amused by the attention, began to make more devices, selling them quietly under the pretense of personal massagers. There was nothing obscene about it in her eyes. It was merely practical engineering, but practicality has always been dangerous when it touches forbidden pleasure. Within a year, rumours of the invention had reached towns far beyond her own. Merchants visited her cottage, asking to buy the design. When she refused, citing her fear of gossip, one buyer registered a patent in his own name. The record survives, though his invention was nothing but her creation copied line for line. Still, the story could not be contained. Newspapers mentioned a miraculous feminine comfort machine, though never directly stated its purpose. Doctors discreetly ordered models for their private clinics. Husbands, blissfully unaware, thought they were buying harmless tools to ease muscle pain. What began as a domestic curiosity became an underground phenomenon. Women purchased them through catalogues coded in the language of restorative therapy. In parlours and bedrooms across England, these small devices hummed quietly beneath layers of silk and lace. The sound was faint enough to be mistaken for the ticking of a clock, yet its impact was profound. For the first time, pleasure could be mechanized, portable, and entirely private. If anything proves how innovation can outsmart morality, it is that even coal could be turned into rebellion. As demand grew, the Church predictably denounced the invention, calling it an insult to modesty. But the criticism was hollow. The device was too convenient, too efficient, and far too satisfying to disappear. Like all forbidden things in Victorian society, it thrived under secrecy. Pharmacies sold them as vibratory therapy kits. Some doctors even recommended them for patients with depression and anxiety. What had started as a scandal became, for a time, respectable science, until someone inevitably noticed who was profiting from it. The old woman never sought fame. She continued repairing sewing machines and tending her garden. Her neighbours described her as gentle and shy, unaware that her creation had travelled the world. When interviewed late in her life by a curious journalist, she reportedly said that she never meant to challenge anyone. She only wanted to help people rest. It is difficult to know if she was being modest or simply careful. Victorian women had a way of surviving by pretending not to know what they knew. After her death, the device continued to evolve. Manufacturers replaced coal with hand cranks, then with electricity. Each version became smaller, quieter, and more powerful. The name of the first inventor faded into myth, replaced by company logos and advertisements featuring smiling women holding delicate boxes. Yet those who knew the story spoke of her with reverence. In a world where men controlled nearly every invention, hers had been made for women and by one of their own. Her gravestone, simple and unadorned, bore an inscription that would later baffle historians to the woman who brought joy without witness. It was rumoured that her granddaughter added the words secretly, knowing their double meaning. Some say the phrase was changed years later to something more neutral, but the original sentiment remained in the whispers passed down through generations of women. The legacy of her work was not just mechanical, it was psychological. Her invention symbolized a shift from dependence to autonomy. Women no longer needed doctors, priests, or husbands to mediate their access to relief. For the first time, satisfaction could exist outside of permission. That quiet transformation carried more power than any public protest. It was progress that no law could ban and no sermon could erase. Historians today might debate whether her story is myth or fact, but myths often say more about truth than records do. The old woman's creation captured a moment when necessity and defiance merged into one. The world wanted to forget her name, but women never did. Somewhere between medicine and sin, she had found liberation, wrapped in gears and ash. Her life remained ordinary, yet her invention changed the extraordinary. From her small hands came a symbol of rebellion that fit easily inside a drawer. It hummed softly beneath layers of cloth, a secret heartbeat in the dark. The empire of men had factories, laws, and armies. She had invention, and invention, in her hands, became a kind of grace. The old woman never lived to see how far her machine would travel, but her spirit lingered in every hidden vibration across 1,000 quiet rooms. The hum of her creation became the anthem of a generation too polite to speak, but too alive to stop. The story of her device blurred the lines between sin and science, comfort and courage. And as society looked for ways to reclaim control, it failed to see that power had already shifted. While the coal burned gently within her small contraption, something greater was set alight, the beginning of women creating their own salvation. One pulse at a time. In the quiet privacy of their homes, women began to realize that pleasure had given them something far greater than relief. The treatments, the machines, the rituals that society had mocked or forbidden. These moments were reshaping their understanding of themselves. Beneath the layers of lace and duty, they discovered a hidden well of confidence that no sermon, no husband, no doctor could suppress. For the first time, they were not just being healed, they were awakening. It is strange how something so small and silent could do what centuries of speeches about freedom never managed to achieve. The act itself was not about defiance at first. It was about survival, about finding stillness in a life ruled by expectation. Victorian women had been trained to see their bodies as burdens, their desires as weaknesses, yet the moment of release, that trembling edge between breath and silence, felt like truth. It did not ask for permission. It did not demand an apology. It reminded them that inside the walls of every parlour and chapel, beneath the polite smiles and corseted waists, There existed a force that belonged only to them. What began as therapy became revelation. Some women described the sensation as a return to the self, others as a brief miracle. Their language avoided sin but hinted at divinity. They began to understand that the body, long treated as a cage, could also be a temple. The discovery was intoxicating, not just for the pleasure it gave, but for the autonomy it implied. They could feel, and in feeling, they could exist beyond ownership. If independence had a heartbeat, it might sound exactly like that faint rhythm beneath the sheets. The effects spread quietly through every layer of society. Servants saw their mistresses change, speaking with a little more certainty, walking with a little more ease. Husbands noticed that their wives no longer trembled under their words. In tea circles and sewing groups, the conversation shifted ever so slightly. Women spoke less about their ailments and more about their ambitions. No one mentioned why, but everyone felt it. A transformation was underway, carried by a secret no one dared to name. The body had become a classroom, and pleasure was the teacher. Through it, women learned boundaries, balance, and self-worth. They realized that their emotions were not curses but messages. The trembling that had once been dismissed as hysteria now became proof of vitality. The exhaustion they had been told was weakness turned out to be the cost of repression. Slowly, quietly, they began to demand more from themselves, from their lives, and from the men who once ruled them. Writers and reformers took note. In pamphlets about women's health, coded phrases began to appear: energy renewal, inner strength, the harmony of body and soul. These were not metaphors, they were declarations, hidden in plain sight. Victorian modesty required that rebellion wear a mask, and so it did, dressed in polite medical language. Yet behind every euphemism was the same truth: a woman who knew her own pleasure could no longer be completely controlled. This new awareness spilled into art and literature. Paintings of women once depicted as fragile muses began to show them gazing directly at the viewer. Poems written by female authors spoke not of yearning but of certainty. Even the way women carried themselves changed. The shoulders straightened, the eyes lifted, and the silence that once served as submission became contemplation. The shift was subtle, but irreversible. They were no longer asking to be understood. They were learning to understand themselves. The church still preached chastity. The doctors still muttered about nerves. But the sermons began to sound outdated, and the diagnoses less convincing. The true cure had already been found, one that required no confession and no prescription. It was not medicine in the traditional sense, but it healed something deeper than any tonic or prayer ever could. Women who once knelt in shame now stood upright, feeling the quiet power pulsing within them like a hidden star. This empowerment did not roar, it whispered. It moved through drawing rooms, across cities, through generations. A mother would pass it to her daughter, not through words, but through the calm in her presence. A friend would share it in a glance, a smile, a gentle nod that said, "You know too, don't you?" And so, what had begun as a scandal became a shared secret, a thread connecting women across class and distance. Men, sensing the shift, grew restless. Their authority relied on being needed, but the women no longer seemed dependent. They spoke with patience rather than fear. They negotiated rather than obeyed. The change was quiet but terrifying to those who had built their lives upon control. They could not fight what they could not see, and what they could not see was now everywhere. The concept of virtue began to fracture. Was it virtue to obey, or to know oneself? Could a woman still be pure if she understood her desires? The questions lingered, uncomfortable and unresolved, but they marked the birth of a new consciousness. For the first time, Victorian women began to see that control over their bodies meant control over their destinies. That realization was dangerous because it was irreversible. Once a woman saw herself as whole, she could not return to being half. Once she felt power within, no law or husband could take it away. The vibration of machines may have started the awakening, But the true movement had nothing to do with mechanics. It was the rediscovery of will, wrapped in flesh and quiet confidence. The empire that prided itself on conquest had overlooked its most profound rebellion, the one that happened not on battlefields but in bedrooms. This new form of power did not seek to rule others, it sought to own oneself, and that made it unstoppable. Each moment of release became an unspoken prayer, not to any god above but to the strength within. What the Victorians called shame was, in truth, enlightenment. What they feared as corruption was awakening, and the women who embraced it no longer looked outward for permission. They had found something unbreakable in themselves, something no man could touch or name, and as that awareness spread, it began to reshape everything around them, from the tone of their voices to the choices they dared to make. The discovery of pleasure had opened a door that would never close again. Beyond it lay the future, one that frightened men and freed women in equal measure, when the laws began to tighten and the clinics began to close. A strange silence settled over the homes of Victorian women. The machines that had once hummed quietly beneath beds or in dresser drawers disappeared one by one. The doctors who had once whispered about healing withdrew their services, fearful of public disgrace. The newspapers printed stern warnings about improper devices, and the church declared victory against moral decay. Yet what they truly created was not purity, but emptiness. The women who had learned to touch power in its most intimate form suddenly found that power taken from them. It is almost cruel how society can celebrate virtue while quietly starving the soul. The change was not visible at first. Women still dressed the same, smiled at church, and performed their duties with grace. But something vital had gone missing. The light in their eyes dimmed. The laughter that once rose in hushed circles became brittle. Inside, resentment brewed where once there had been calm. They were told that virtue was its own reward, but virtue could not fill the void left behind. The quiet hum that had once lulled their anxieties was replaced by the ticking of clocks and the sighs of unfinished thoughts. For those who had come to depend on their treatments, the loss was unbearable. Sleep grew shallow, tempers shortened, and moods darkened into fog. Some turned to opium or laudanum to dull the ache, trading one form of relief for another, less forgiving one. Others threw themselves into charity work or church service, desperate to bury their frustration beneath the weight of good deeds. But beneath every act of piety, the same restlessness remained. They had tasted autonomy, and the absence of it was suffocating. Homes once filled with warmth became colder. Marriages that had briefly revived through the illusion of calm now cracked again under unspoken strain. Husbands, unaware of what had changed, accused their wives of hysteria or bitterness. They called them ungrateful, moody, or tired. None of them understood that what their wives had lost was not luxury or indulgence, but identity. They had been whole for the first time in their lives, and now they were splintered again. It is bitterly ironic that when women stopped being treated as patients, they became seen as problems. In the poorer districts, the loss was even more severe. The few women who could afford the cheap replicas of the old devices watched them break or burn out, their small fires extinguished by fear and law. The black market for therapy tools grew quietly, hidden behind curtains and coded advertisements. What had once been medical was now criminal, and that shift carried shame. Women who sought relief were labelled as fallen. The same act that once symbolised healing now symbolised sin. The hypocrisy was exhausting, but no one dared speak it aloud. Doctors returned to diagnosing nervous disorders, prescribing tonics that did nothing and rescues that made everything worse. Beds became prisons again. Women were confined to their rooms, told to eat broth and think less. They obeyed, outwardly calm, but their minds rebelled in silence. The energy that had once found release through their bodies now festered inward. Anger replaced tenderness. Resentment replaced longing. In the absence of pleasure, Even prayer lost its comfort. The divine no longer felt close. The hymns that once soothed them began to sound hollow, like echoes in an empty hall. The world that had briefly expanded through self-awareness had contracted again, until all that remained was obedience. They lived, but without vividness. They functioned, but without joy. They became ghosts in their own homes, drifting from duty to duty, unseen and unfulfilled. The change was not limited to the body, it rippled through generations. Daughters grew up watching their mothers move through life like shadows, dutiful but detached. They learned early that survival meant silence. Curiosity was punished, imagination was dangerous, and so, a new kind of woman emerged, disciplined, elegant, and hollow. The Empire applauded her composure, unaware that it was the calm of exhaustion, not peace. The anger had nowhere to go. It simmered beneath every polite conversation and every act of domestic perfection. It hid behind embroidered smiles and careful postures. Some women lashed out at servants or children. Others turned their rage inward, convinced that the problem was their own weakness. But the truth was simple when the body is denied its natural rhythm. The mind fractures in quiet rebellion. The human spirit can endure hunger, grief, and loneliness. But the denial of self-knowledge is a cruelty few survive intact. Writers began to notice the change. Novels written by women took on a sharper edge, filled with restlessness and quiet defiance. Painters began to portray female figures not as delicate or angelic, but as watchful and distant, eyes cast somewhere beyond the viewer's reach. The collective frustration had become art. It was not a scream, but a hum beneath the surface of culture, waiting for a generation brave enough to voice it. The world believed it had restored morality. In truth, it had built a new kind of madness. A society that silences pleasure will always breed rage. And Victorian women learned to live with both buried in the same breath. They became masters of restraint, their composure so perfect that no one saw the tension underneath. Yet beneath the stillness, something continued to stir, a quiet refusal to disappear entirely. This period of deprivation revealed an uncomfortable truth: control could suppress expression, but never erase it. The body remembers what the mind is told to forget. The memory of freedom, once awakened, does not die, it waits, and in that waiting, it gathers strength. The emptiness that replaced ecstasy did not destroy these women, it forged them. It taught them that silence, too, can be a weapon, and that endurance is often the first step toward rebellion. Their anger would not remain quiet forever. It was patient, deliberate, and growing sharper each day. When the day finally came that women began to speak openly of rights and equality, the world pretended to be surprised. But the revolution had begun long before, in bedrooms that had fallen silent. It was born from loss, not abundance, from frustration, not freedom. The Empire believed it had extinguished temptation, yet in truth, it had only created hunger, and hunger, in time, always finds a voice. In the long shadow of Victorian society, a woman's life was rarely her own. From birth to death, every decision was spoken for her, wrapped in the language of duty and virtue. She was told whom to marry, how to behave, what to believe, and when to stay silent. Her worth was measured by her obedience, her purity, and her usefulness. But beneath the heavy fabric of that obedience, there existed one small corner that no one could govern. It was not written in law or preached in church. It existed in the quiet tremor of her own choosing. It is almost poetic that in a world ruled entirely by men, the smallest movement of a woman's body could be the purest act of rebellion. That moment of release, hidden and private, became her only form of freedom. In that instant, she belonged to no one but herself. No husband could dictate it, no priest could confess it, and no doctor could define it. It was her secret language, her sanctuary, her proof that the self still lived beneath the layers of restraint. It was not about sin or indulgence, but about identity. In that brief collapse of control, she reclaimed what had been stolen from her, the right to feel, to exist, to decide. For many, it was the only decision they ever made for themselves. The rest of their lives unfolded like a script written by others, but this one act remained unedited. They could not choose their futures, but they could choose this single moment. It was small, invisible, and yet immeasurably powerful. If freedom were measured not in noise but in knowing, then Victorian women were freer in their silence than their husbands were in their sermons. The irony of the age was painful. The empire prided itself on progress, on invention, on reason. Yet it never understood that its greatest revolution was unfolding quietly inside the minds and bodies of the women it tried to contain. The machines, the therapies, the scandals, they were not about medicine or morality. They were about awakening. The very thing society feared most was not immorality, but awareness. Awareness could not be controlled once it began to spread, and it spread like smoke through every parlour, every prayer, every locked room. Historians later wrote of politics and war, of kings and industrial triumphs. They measured power in inventions and empires, never realizing that another kind of power had been blooming in silence. The women who lived it left few records. Their diaries were burned, their names erased, their discoveries rebranded as curiosities or indecencies. Yet the truth lingered. It hummed beneath the surface of the era, as steady and unyielding as the rhythm that once echoed in their hidden rooms. Every quiet victory begins as a whisper. Every whisper becomes history when someone finally dares to listen. The Victorian woman's triumph was not in defiance but in persistence. She endured, adapted, and carried her secret forward until it no longer had to hide. What began as a private act of healing became the first spark of independence that would one day burn in public. By the time the new century arrived, the machines had changed, the dresses had loosened, and women had begun to speak in their own voices. But the true beginning had already happened in the dark. It began with one realization, that even in the most restricted life, there remained one choice that no man could steal. It was not taught, not given, not approved, it was felt, and in that feeling lay everything. To look back now is to see not shame but courage. These women did not wage wars or write manifestos, yet they fought for control over their own existence in the only way they could. Their rebellion was quiet, intimate, and entirely human. It did not demand applause, it simply asked to be remembered. And though history may have turned its gaze elsewhere, their story survives in the knowledge they passed down an inheritance of awareness, a soft echo that still reminds us of what freedom first felt like. Courage, after all, does not always march. Sometimes it hums softly in the dark, waiting for the world to listen. The story of Victorian women is not only about repression, but about survival through self-discovery. It is a reminder that even when stripped of choice, the smallest act of autonomy can hold the greatest meaning. The empire forgot their names, but the echo of their quiet rebellion remains, vibrating through time, still alive in every breath of self-possession. And so, when the world sleeps, their legacy stirs, the gentle sound of defiance dressed as stillness, the heartbeat of every woman who ever dared to choose herself. Sleep now, and let their story fade softly into the night. May you rest knowing that even in silence, power can bloom. Good night.